Hey everyone, and welcome to the history and development of every single Nintendo home console. We're going to start off first with the Famicom down there and work our way up to the Nintendo Switch here, just in time for the launch of the Switch 2 in just a few weeks' time. So let's begin this story in 1983 and the original Famicom. So although the Famicom is Nintendo's first proper game console with interchangeable cartridges, it wasn't their first TV game system. That was actually the TV Game 6 here, which was released in 1977. So that's how this system looked, and it was nothing more than a basic Pong clone. But over the next 3 years they actually released a variety of different all-in-one systems like that, the last one of which came out in 1980. Which was just called the Computer TV Game. And the year after that, in 1981, after no longer working on the TV colour game consoles, they set out to build the Famicom, which was their first proper interchangeable cartridge designed system. And Nintendo's president at the time was adamant that this console should cost less than 10,000 yen, and the developers really struggled over the next 2 years to cut the costs down as much as possible. In the end, they couldn't quite manage it, and it retailed for 14,000 yen, which wasn't far off, and actually Nintendo's president at the time, Mr. Yamauchi, was actually very happy with the end result, and he said they managed to get it as low as physically possible. And if you're curious, that 14,000 yen equated to around $100 US or about £78 at the time, and taking inflation into account, that equates to around 20,000 Japanese yen today, which is around 140 American dollars or around £108 here in the UK. So that kind of puts it into perspective. It was actually still a very cheap system, even if you compare it to today's standards. So once the system was finalised and the price was finalised, they went out to about 80 wholesalers to try and find people to market and sell this product in Japan. And because they hadn't worked with any third parties before, this was an entirely Nintendo-based system, and it only included 3 launch games. They were Donkey Kong, Popeye, and Donkey Kong Jr., all 3 of which being arcade ports, and that was really the selling point of the system. At the time, it was to play the arcade games at home, and they did a great job with the ports as well. They're not quite arcade perfect, but they're close enough that the majority of people at the time probably wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. And as far as Nintendo was concerned, there was no third-party support planned whatsoever. And because this was their first major home console, there wasn't really any big events or trade shows where they actually showed this off for the first time either. The Japanese gaming landscape at the time was very different to how it is today as well. There wasn't really any popular home consoles around the same time in 1983. There were a few. There was the Epoch Cassette Vision, which was released in 1981, which is another interchangeable cartridge device. There was the Magnavox Odyssey 2, which is a very similar machine as well. The Intellivision, which was a little bit more powerful than those and had a few more interesting games. But most importantly, in Japan was their PC scene. They actually had a series of computers released by NEC called the NEC PC88 series, and they were very popular in Japan at the time. They came out in 1981, so a few years before the Famicom, and actually they came out the year that Nintendo started developing for the Famicom. And of course, Nintendo had their previous 5 consoles still on sale at the time as well, so there wasn't really that much competition in the home video game market. And what's really wild about this release, the release date, by the way, was the 15th of July 1983, and on that exact same day, Sega also released their first home video game console, the SG-1000, so it's wild that both of them released on exactly the same day, and neither of them had had proper home consoles before that either. So really, the console wars began immediately on launch day. Of course, Nintendo dominated in Japan, and Sega, with the SG-3000 and also the Mark II and III afterwards, could never really properly catch up, but we will be getting back to Sega when we move on to the worldwide launch a bit later on in this video. So Nintendo released the Famicom in 1983, and it was off to a slow start, and it wouldn't be until another 2 years' time that the console came out outside of Japan. But what happened in those 2 years in between, and did they impact the release overseas? Well, let's take a look at what happened. So they finally got third-party support for the system in 1984 with some very, very strict requirements for third parties to get their games onto Nintendo's consoles. They really wanted to maintain the quality and, I guess, not take away sales from their first-party releases too. Hudson was actually the very first third-party manufacturer, and the first game that they released for the system I've actually got right here, and it was Lode Runner. And all of the original games for the Famicom had these really plain logos as well. They just had like little waves on the front and just the name of the game in black writing. But Famicom cartridges are a whole nother story that I would love to cover in a future video. I'm definitely going to get back to that, but let's move on from Hudson and the rest of the third-party developers. Namco was also there. They released Galaxian and Pac-Man, so even more amazing arcade conversions for the system. And by the end of 1984, there was actually 30 different games released for the system, which is far better than 1983's 4 games, because they also got the original Mario Brothers at the end of that year. And also in 1983 as well, Atari released their first game console in Japan, away from their home country of America. That was the Atari 2800, and it was a complete failure in Japan, but overseas, Atari was also failing spectacularly in America, and Nintendo saw this. They saw the video game crash of '83, as it's very well known these days, and they did not want a repeat of that. So let's take a look now at what Nintendo attempted to do to combat the video game crash in America. So Nintendo knew that third-party support for the Atari was a big player in the downfall of the system and the industry as a whole. There was far too many games being released and the quality was just not there. The story's a legend at this point. Games were being buried in landfill and it was just a disaster for the industry. So Nintendo wanted to take a completely different approach to marketing the console over in America. First of all, they completely redesigned the system because they did not think that this design, with its attached controllers on very, very short cords and the general kid-friendliness of the design, would not appeal to the American audience. So at CES in 1985, Nintendo debuted the Advanced Video System, a completely reimagined version of the Famicom for the American audience. It's very different to what ended up coming out over in America, but these prototype systems do look really, really interesting. But there was one thing that they failed to realize. They really overcomplicated this original release. They weren't just showing off the console, they were showing off attachable keyboards, a music keyboard as well as a writing keyboard. There was a disk drive, there was wireless controllers, there was a light gun. There was just far too much going on, and American consumers at the time just didn't really understand what they were looking at, and a lot of these features got scrapped for the final release. And also, the Advanced Video System was very close to what Atari was calling some of their consoles, and there was kind of a bad connotation around the words video systems. So Nintendo decided to come back a few months later to the summer version of CES, which was hosted in June, with a brand new name, the Video Entertainment System, which is very close to the final name for the system, and they didn't show the keyboard off this time either. Instead, they decided to show off Rob, the robotic operating buddy, a complete robot to go alongside the video game console, because they thought if they marketed the Nintendo Entertainment System as a toy instead of a game console, they could get into different distributors and maybe they could distance themselves from some of that stigma around the video game market. So in November 1985, Nintendo showed off yet another redesigned version of the console, which is the one we ended up with, the Nintendo Entertainment System here, and they were really proud of this front-loading feature that kind of made it similar to a VCR, which they thought would fit in a lot nicer with the American homes back in the day, and I really do like this design. And they also announced an official launch date, which strangely was only for New York, and they wanted to test the waters very carefully before spreading out to the rest of America in the months to follow. And before the official launch, which was 18th of November 1985 in New York, they actually threw a pre-release launch party on October 9th in New York as well, to show off the system and some of the games and to give away a bunch of merchandise before the launch of the system, which I think would have been really exciting for people at the time to go and experience this. And as well as Rob the Robot, it actually launched as a bundle that came with the robot, and it also came with the Zapper here as well, which came with a game called Duck Hunt, where you could point at the screen like this and shoot the ducks. So Nintendo was really going for a range of different gameplay ideas. Of course, it came with the standard controller with a much longer cable than the ones that came out in Japan as well. So you had traditional games, you had light gun games, and you had robotic operated games as well. And I'm sure kids in America at the time were so excited about all of these new unique ways to play video games. And also, unlike the Japanese launch, this actually launched with around 16 or 17 games. And I say "or" because for some reason there is no concrete proof that Super Mario Bros. Was a launch title for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but I've scoured the internet and there is not a single concrete release date for Super Mario, but the rest of the 16 launch titles were definitely there day one. And you can take a look at them over the screen right now. I think it's a great set of launch games. Obviously, they're very basic compared to what came out later in the system's life, but there's a great range of different genres, and there really is a game for everyone in this lineup. It really is amazing. So the soft launch for the Nintendo Entertainment System was in November 1985 in New York, and it would take a few more months until February 1986 when they expanded outside of New York, and their next destination was Los Angeles. And as well as that, Mattel actually picked up the license to distribute the Nintendo Entertainment System in Canada, and they also started doing that in February 1986 as well. And surprisingly, for most of the rest of that year, they were the only three places that you could actually buy the system outside of Japan. It wasn't until September that year that the rest of the United States actually got their hands on the Nintendo Entertainment System. And by September, it was out all across America and all across Japan. So now let's take a look at the rest of the world, and there's some really, really interesting stories here. Let's start with Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has always been a fascinating place for video games, and the launch of the NES is absolutely crazy. Not only did they start importing Famicoms as soon as the system launched in Japan, so way back in 1983, you could have gone into a computer store in Hong Kong and been able to pick yourself up a family computer complete in box just like this, but also in 1986, they started importing the Nintendo Entertainment System as well. So already by the start of 1986 you had access to both Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System, and I assume a bunch of imported games for both consoles as well. What's even stranger about Hong Kong is the fact that they actually got official releases of both the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System by Nintendo. And they came in their own completely original blue boxes that said Hong Kong version for use in Hong Kong only. So I have no idea why they released both consoles. Surely that would just confuse people because it's mostly the same games on both. So not only did they get the NES and the Famicom, but even crazier is the fact that their Famicom release in Hong Kong, which was released by a company called Simon & Toys, is really interesting because it actually has a switch on the back that allows you to switch between 50 and 60 Hertz, because Hong Kong has like dual TV displays, and that's a conversation for another video, but it's so fascinating. But it was an NTSC console, but it had PAL output, and you could either switch between PAL 50 or PAL 60 because Hong Kong used the PAL TV format at the time. Hong Kong is a fascinating history of Nintendo all on its own, and actually AK Family Home did a great video on the history of Nintendo in Hong Kong, and I used some of that video for the research for this one, so definitely check that out after. And now let's move on to our next region worldwide, which is actually Venezuela. Yes, we're going there, Venezuela. So first of all, piracy is rampant in Venezuela and much of South America as well, but Venezuela in particular is interesting because they had a lot of money at the time, and they had a semi-official distributor from Nintendo called Nintendo CA, which was kind of half official and half unofficial, but they did actually release their own versions of the NES and the Famicom, so again, just like Hong Kong, they had both different versions of the system. But Nintendo CA would also release their own weird unlicensed versions of ROM hacks at the time, which was really strange. So there was a game called Mario 16, which was just a ROM hack of a different game, and it put Mario sprite on there. And there's a bunch of these other games released at the time in Venezuela by Nintendo CA, and the whole thing just makes absolutely no sense to me. It's just a really muddy mess of legalities, and I don't really understand anything that was going on in there, but I just thought it was really interesting that it was kind of a semi-official release of the console too. Right, where shall we go next? I'm loving making this video, by the way. So next, let's go to South Korea. Let's see what South Korea did with the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom. Actually, Nintendo wasn't allowed to do anything. It was Hyundai that released the Famicom in Korea, and they called it the Comboy. So, at the time, due to the political climate, Korea didn't want to import any Japanese hardware into the country, so Nintendo got around this loophole by partnering up with Hyundai, who released the Nintendo Entertainment System under their own name, so they called it the Hyundai Comboy. But interestingly, it still has Nintendo's name on the console, and it says Nintendo Entertainment System Korea version. And it's actually modelled after the North American version of the Nintendo Entertainment System, not the Japanese one, and even more interestingly, it only plays games from Korea, so only games that Hyundai actually published in that region. It has a completely different lockout chip to the American console. I can't really find much more information out about it online. There wasn't many games released for it, and apparently it didn't sell very well either, because most of the Famicoms and NESs that came out in Korea were the same kind of black market, counterfeit consoles that were kind of clones of Famicom hardware, so no one wanted to buy the more expensive official versions. Although, by doing a bit of research online, I did find out that Nintendo partnered with Hyundai again for the launch of the Super Nintendo a few years later, and that one did a little bit better. But how about the rest of Asia? Well, Nintendo didn't stop at just Korea, Venezuela, and North America. They also went to the rest of Asia and made a specific Asia version of the console. So I think they did this because of the 50-60Hz and PAL NTSC conversion issues around different parts of Asia, depending on where they got their TV technology from first. So what's really interesting about these Asia-specific versions of the consoles is that they're completely region-free. They can play PAL and NTSC games. There isn't much more to say about these, and they also didn't sell very well because of the piracy across Asia at the time and all of the different clone systems, which had already been out for years before Nintendo finally got around to releasing their official versions of the console. But again, it's a very interesting curiosity. Let's not forget about our friends over in Brazil though, and Brazil has always been known as the country of Sega, and yeah, Sega basically had a complete foothold in the Brazilian market, and it wasn't actually until 1995 that Nintendo first stepped foot in Brazil with the Nintendo Entertainment System, but because of tariffs and other license agreements making it very difficult for official consoles to be released in Brazil for any reasonable amount of money, they actually partnered with a company called Gradiente under their Playtronic label, and they finally released the Nintendo in 1995, but I'm sure it was far too late by that point and it didn't do very well at all. But it's just another one of those interesting releases. And they're just the official releases. I have a big list here of all of the different bootleg Famicom and NES consoles that came out, some of which came out far before Nintendo ever officially released their systems too. There was the Dynavision 2 by Dynacom, there was the Bit System by Dismac, the High Top Game by Milmar, the Top Game aka VG9000 by CCE, the Phantom System also by Gradotine, there was the Supercharger by IBTC, Dynavision 3, the Handyvision, and the Genicom as well, which doesn't actually have an official release year. So they were just some of the many bootlegs that were floating around in Asia that were competing for a piece of Nintendo's pie in those markets. So that was Asia, North America, a bit of South America, and Japan. But what about Europe? Europe's even more of a mess. Are you ready for this? So the first difficult thing for Nintendo in Europe was the fact that they had no European headquarters. They had no way of distributing the console themselves in those markets. unlike North America, unlike Japan, Europe is very divided up into completely different countries with completely different languages and completely different businesses too. There was also different business legislations in the different regions, as well as different TV specifications too, so there was so many things to take into consideration, and this was just a minefield for Nintendo. And also in Europe, the video game landscape was very different to the rest of the world as well, because by that point in around 1986, Europe was already solidified as a video gaming area, and they had loads of different home consoles, microcomputers, and arcades all competing for the video game market. So the Atari 2600 had already been around for almost a decade at that point, having released in 1978, and built up quite a big nice market share over there in Europe. The Intellivision came out in 1982 and also did quite well over there as well. The ColecoVision also came out in 1982, and Nintendo actually supported the ColecoVision with some official games for that system as well, and also the Atari 2600 too. The Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC were all taking over the UK at the time as well, with the boom of the microcomputers, and unlike America, there was no video game crash in Europe, so video games were still going strong, and Nintendo had a lot more to compete with over there. So let's begin with Scandinavia, because for Nintendo, Scandinavia was actually the easiest part of Europe for them to get into, because they already had a distributor there called Bergsala, who had been distributing the Game & Watch systems since 1981. So thanks to them, the Nintendo Entertainment System actually began selling in Sweden in September of 1986, which was only a year after the American launch. And thanks to Bergsala's outreach, Norway and Finland were the second two countries to get involved in the Nintendo Entertainment System in early 1987. And this new Nintendo distribution did so well for Bergsala, who were also a toy distributor and games distributor, they stopped everything to focus 100% on Nintendo. And I love this photo from their offices at the time. So when they were distributing the NES back in 1986, they had this giant statue of Mario outside of their offices. That original statue of Mario actually stayed there for 20 years, and unfortunately it got replaced after that with a much more modern interpretation of Mario, who's now coming out of a pipe instead of just standing on this weird column in the middle of nowhere. But the really cool thing about the Bergsala offices that are now rebranded to just Nintendo, they actually also have a museum on campus which is still open to this day, and there's some photos from inside here, and it looks like they've got some really interesting promotional statues from a variety of different periods in Nintendo's history, and they all look a little bit creepy, I'm not gonna lie. So the second area in Europe to start selling the NES was actually Germany. Just like Scandinavia, they already had a distributor for the Game & Watch, and that was a German company, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, so feel free to correct me in the comments down below. It was called Bienengraber, I think. Anyway, this Bienengraber company had been around since the early 1980s, and they sold the Game & Watch under a brand called Trickotronic, I think. And again, they also managed to launch the Nintendo Entertainment System in September of 1986, but only in one retailer. That was somewhere called Media Market, which looks to be something kind of like Target as an American equivalent, so just a big general department store that was big in Germany at the time. So that's how you could go and buy your Nintendo Entertainment System in Germany in September of 1986. Unfortunately, that company went bankrupt just a few years later in 1990, and Nintendo actually decided to set up their European headquarters in Germany and took over the distribution from that original company also in 1990, so they carried on the distribution in Germany and eventually around the rest of Europe. But before that, there is still a lot more confusion to come, so let's move on to the mess that is France. And goodness me, France sounds like it went through some problems to get the Nintendo Entertainment System onto the shelves. So they didn't have any distributors for Nintendo stuff before then, or at least not any that reached out and managed to get licenses for the Entertainment System. So in 1987, at another CES show, a company called ASD, which stands for Audio Sound Distribution, went there with the hopes of getting the distribution rights to either the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Sega Master System, and they somehow managed to get Nintendo's grace to greenlight their distribution for Nintendo in France, and they were hoping to begin selling the system in September of 1987, but they encountered many issues along the way. So unfortunately, they were hoping to sell something like 100,000 units, but not only did they get delivered late, but they only got 10,000 of them. So unfortunately, not only did they only receive 10,000 systems, which is far shorter than the expectations that the manufacturers had set, they actually only got those 10,000 systems to last all the way up until the end of 1987. So the system was off to a very bad start in France, and it just got even worse because there was an economic downturn at the time, and the company couldn't afford to keep paying Nintendo to get the consoles and get the games shipped over to France. So in the end, Bandai ended up buying the Nintendo Entertainment System rights off the company in 1988. And Bandai managed to turn this around and managed to sell a further 60,000 units by the end of 1988. Still not many compared to the rest of the world, but it was a great start, and Bandai is someone who would go on to work very closely with Nintendo in the future. So now let's take a look at the UK, as well as Italy and Australia, interestingly. Here in the UK, Mattel actually picked up the rights to the Nintendo Entertainment System. Yes, the same people who make things like Hot Wheels and Barbie. And that was a massive issue because Mattel actually treated the Nintendo just like a toy. So it went on sale here in the UK officially in 1987. But as I said earlier, the UK was already very deep into the microcomputer scene, and most gamers were just interested in that. And the games for those systems were a lot cheaper than what Mattel was selling the Nintendo Entertainment System games for. You could pick up games here in the UK from places like WH Smith's or Boots or Woolworths. You could get games for like £5 or £10 for a lot of these microcomputers, and Mattel was selling NES games for like £30 or £40, which was just unheard of here in the UK. So at first, it didn't do very well at all. Mattel also did something very frustrating, and they actually made our system here in the UK completely incompatible with any games from any other region, including the rest of Europe, which is, as far as I know, the only console that's ever locked us out from the rest of Europe. And another mistake that Mattel made, they only actually sold the Nintendo through the retailer Boots, which a lot of you will probably know as a pharmaceutical chain more than anything, and for as long as I've known Boots, it's just the place where I bought my meal deals at work, so not really the place that you would go to buy a brand new Nintendo console. Although, maybe back in the 80s things were a little bit different, because I did hear they did sell games back then, but even so, it's still a very small distributor, and it wasn't available in any of the bigger retailers in the UK at the time. And because it was Mattel, and they were treating it like toys rather than a video game system, for the games that didn't sell, they actually just took them off store shelves and just put them in storage. So once a game had been on the store shelves for a few months, if it didn't do very well, that's it. It would just disappear into the ether and would never be sold again as far as Mattel was concerned. So unfortunately, that was the life of the Nintendo Entertainment System for the first 2 years on sale in the UK. That was until 1989, when a different company called Sans Serif picked up the rights to the Nintendo Entertainment System from Mattel and finally managed to turn things around for the company. And interestingly, Sans Serif was actually ran by a former Sega executive, so it's really interesting that he jumped ship from Sega to Nintendo and actually turned Nintendo's fortunes around. And the way they did that was very interesting. So at the time, in the late 80s and early 90s, Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles was very popular in the UK, and they actually released a new bundle of the console which included the new Hero Turtles game, and that went on to do incredibly well for Nintendo, even though they were kind of against the idea because they didn't want it being bundled with a third-party game. But even so, it did really well, and it actually righted a lot of the wrongs that Mattel did, and they finally got rid of that weird Mattel branding on the front of the system, and it was just rebranded as the Nintendo Entertainment System NES Edition. So there's 2 different versions of the NES here in the UK, and even more interestingly, there's actually 2 different versions of the original Super Mario. So the version of Super Mario that I've got here is the version that was released in 1990, which was actually distributed by Bandai, as you can see at the top right there. And this is the version that's compatible with the Sans Serif version of the NES. this version right here, which my parents picked up in, I think, 1992 from Woolworths, and this is the original box from back then. I'm really happy to own this. But back on the topic of Super Mario, there's actually two completely different versions of the Super Mario game. So there was this version that was distributed by Bandai, but there was also a previous Mattel version, and they actually play completely differently too. So this version is actually fixed to run at the proper speed and proper frame rate, but the music is too fast, whereas the Mattel version is exactly the same as the North American release of the game, and it's not actually sped up at all for our 50Hz compatible systems and TVs here in the UK. So the Mattel version actually plays 16% slower than this version, so that means slower music, slower gameplay, whereas in this one, the music's too fast. So as far as I'm aware, there is not a version of Super Mario in the UK that plays at the right speed and has the right music. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I just think that's a really fascinating thing. And I've actually ordered the Mattel version of Mario, and I'll do a follow-up video where I test out the two side by side so you can see the difference for yourselves. And the same thing applied to Italy and Australia as well. And speaking of regions as well, Australia, Italy, United Kingdom, they all have Region A, whereas the rest of Europe has Region B. And for those earlier systems, they're not compatible with each other. So the Mattel version, Region A, can't be played in Europe, and the European Region B can't be played on PAL A systems. It's very complicated and probably unnecessary as well, but that's just how it goes. So what were Nintendo's plans to carry on the success of the Famicom to their next home console? Let's take a look now at the history of the Super Nintendo. This story begins in 1986 in Japan. And the story of the Super Nintendo doesn't actually begin with Nintendo, it actually begins with Hudson. They were actually one of the first third-party developers for the Famicom, and as well as releasing their own games, in 1984 Nintendo actually let Hudson develop the Family Basic programming language for the Famicom, which actually allowed people to plug a keyboard into the system in order to write your own games. By building this software for Nintendo, Hudson actually gained a really deep understanding of how the hardware worked at a fundamental level, and actually spent the next 2 years creating their own prototype version of a console. And apparently the developers at Hudson are big train nerds, because they actually named their console the C62, which is actually a type of train that uses a Hudson wheel mechanism or something. I'm not entirely sure, but either way, the name C62 and the name Hudson are connected to trains somehow. So they took this C62 console prototype to Nintendo, and they were expecting Nintendo to actually publish that as their successor to the Famicom, but obviously Nintendo was kind of upset that one of their first third-party developers went behind their backs and created a completely brand new console all on their own, so they of course declined that offer and said that Nintendo is better off producing their own hardware. So Hudson carried on without Nintendo and released the C62 under its new name, the PC Engine, on October 30th, 1987. But of course, Nintendo didn't want Hudson to get all the press, so the month before, in September, Nintendo actually first formally announced a successor to the Famicom. And in this original announcement, they also announced that the Super Famicom would also be backwards compatible with the original Famicom, which is something that obviously didn't end up becoming true, but they did try and make it work. So let's skip forward now to 1988 and some more details about the Super Famicom. So it was actually almost another year entirely before Nintendo brought up the Super Famicom again. This time they made an announcement in a magazine called Touch. And in it, Mr. Yamauchi, who was the president of Nintendo at the time, gave away the first proper concrete details of the system. So let's take a look at what he said. He began by saying that people were getting bored of the Famicom, and that's the reason that Nintendo needed to create a successor. The specs for the Super Famicom would be announced a few months later, he said, on November 21st, which we'll look at in just a little bit. He did say that the CPU will be a 16-bit CPU, and the sound chip would actually be custom made by Sony, who Nintendo were actually partnering with for the development of the Super Nintendo. He also mentioned that they would be focusing exclusively on quality of games over quantity, and at this event he also announced Super Mario Bros. 4, and he also announced Dragon Quest V, which was actually announced before Enix even knew they were working on the games. And he also said that the target sales by the end of the first year were 3 million units. And also in 1988, Sega announced the Sega Mark V. So if you remember back to the previous episode that I did on the Famicom, Sega actually released the SG-1000 on exactly the same day as the Famicom, but this time Sega would release their next system, which at the time was called the Sega Mark V, but obviously by release it got rebranded to the Sega Mega Drive. They would actually release that in October 1988, which was actually 2 years before Nintendo finally got their 16-bit system out the door. And the Mega Drive would go on to launch in October that year, but of course Nintendo wants to undercut every other game developer out there, so in September, the month before, they announced another special event. Surprisingly, the event was not to announce more details of the Super Famicom, it was actually to show off Super Mario Bros. 3. And I know this isn't a NES focused video because I already did that, but I found this really cool clip of the announcement of Super Mario 3 that's actually been preserved on Nico Nico, so just take a quick look at this. I thought it was really interesting. It actually seems like they announced a lot of other Famicom things at the same time as well, and this is kind of like some weird prototype Nintendo Direct footage from the 80s, which is really cool. And a month after the Mega Drive launched, Nintendo finally held a proper event for the press where they showed off the system and some games and prototypes for the very first time. Unfortunately, also at this event, they had to cancel plans for the full-on backwards compatibility with the original Famicom. Instead, they had this weird workaround that they showed where the Famicom was actually a completely separate redesigned system that would plug into the Super Nintendo next to it, and you would then feed the AV cables into the back of the Super Nintendo, and then it would actually have a Famicom button on the front where you could swap between Super Famicom and original Famicom. And of course in the end they just ended up dropping the idea completely, but it's interesting to see that they tried to hold on to this concept for so long. As for what else they showed off at this event, they showed off a few prototype games and demos. There was a very early demo of Pilot Wings. At the time it was called Dragonfly, and it looks very different. It actually looked a lot more like an action game than the simulation style game that it ended up becoming, but of course it was a great showcase for Mode 7, and I'm sure people at the time were very impressed with what the rotational graphics were able to do. They did also show off a separate Mode 7 demo, which actually does seem closer to what Pilot Wings ended up becoming, so I think they just merged the two together at some point in the future and it became Pilot Wings. There was one other demo which begins with these hot air balloons going up and then a car going past, and I was very fortunate to actually find some footage for this online, so have a look at the third and final demo that they showed off at this event. Interestingly, they also showed off a 16-bit version of Zelda 2, which was shown off in a few magazines the month after, but there's no surviving footage of this, and it's kind of unknown at this point whether it was just that one screenshot that they showed or whether there was actually plans to make a SNES version of Zelda 2. There's nothing really concrete out there online, but it's interesting to see that Nintendo were experimenting with taking some of their older games and moving them up to 16-bit, which of course they did to great effect in the SNES's life with Super Mario All-Stars. So obviously the most exciting thing at this event was the console itself, and it looks fairly similar to the final release, but there are some interesting differences, so let's take a look at those. Just like the Mega Drive, this one also had a headphone socket and a volume slider on the system itself, and it had 3 buttons on the top instead of 2 on the final unit. They were power, reset, and the Famicom button that I talked about to allow it to switch between the Famicom and the Super Famicom AV output. They also showed off the first design of the controller, which instead of having A, B, X and Y, actually had A, B, C and D buttons, and all of the buttons were red instead of the multicolours that we've got on the final one. It also featured an expansion port on the front of the system instead of on the bottom, so it also featured an expansion port on the front next to the 2 controller ports, and a lot of people who have Super Famicoms or Super Nintendos probably haven't even noticed this, but if you turn your system upside down, there's actually still that port here, so if you take this flap, you can actually see that it still exists underneath, and this was to allow it to sit on attachments like the Sony PlayStation if it was going to be an attachable CD drive underneath, or like the Satellaview, which did actually end up coming out in Japan, but as far as I know there wasn't any use for it outside of Japan, but it's interesting that they still kept it regardless. So at this event they were told that the Super Famicom would launch in 1990, but a few months later Miyamoto actually corrected that and said that the system was coming out in 1989 instead. As we all know, in 1989, it wasn't the Super Famicom that came out, it was actually the Game Boy. So Nintendo decided once again to put the release date of the Super Famicom back to 1990, as originally planned, and this would also give third-party developers the time to get their games up and running for the launch of the system too. So in 1989, Nintendo started their own trade show called Shoshinkai, also known as Space World, and this is the event that Nintendo would use all the way up until the release of the GameCube to announce their new hardware. So there was a lot more information showed off at Shoshinkai that year. So in July 1989 at the Shoshinkai event, Nintendo showed off the Super Famicom again with another hardware revision that much more closely resembles this final release right here. But there were a few very interesting differences and a few new prototypes shown off at the show as well. So let's take a look. So this design is almost identical to the final release, except it had a red power button instead of the grey one that we got on the final system, and it still retained the headphone socket and volume dial on the side as well. The most interesting thing about this particular prototype is the fact that last year, in April 2024, it actually went up for sale on Yahoo Auctions Japan, and it ended up amassing over $3 million before it was pulled from auction, and no one's heard or seen anything from it since. Such a strange event, but it's really cool that one of them is still out there. And on that version as well, it also had the smaller controller ports and the extension port on the front as well, and there was a second revision that was shown a little bit later on that removed that port and obviously put it on the bottom like the final release. And the other cool thing that was showed off at Shoshinkai was the first reveal of Super Mario World as well, and this version of the game is completely different to what was finally released. And what is so cool about this is the fact that over the years, a lot more information has come out about this first prototype from 1989. There was a bunch of screenshots in magazines, there's some video out there online as well, and what fans have managed to do is actually recreate that entire first presentation of Super Mario World and put it onto a ROM as well, and I actually hooked it up on the CRT over there using the EverDrive and actually got to experience for myself what people would have seen and played in 1989, and it's so interesting to see the kind of mix of Super Mario 3 and what would finally become Super Mario World in one game. And obviously the levels are all completely broken and it doesn't feel anything like the final release, but it's so cool to see this in really high detail rather than the really low quality scans that have been floating out around there online all this time. So that's what happened at the Shoshinkai event in 1989. And now let's move on to 1990, and finally the public actually get their hands on the system for the first time. So at their next Shoshinkai event, which was the year later in August 1990, the final version of the system was finally shown off, this one right here. And as well as that, they also invited the public to this event, and there was a whole range of games for them to play as well, including ActRaiser, Super Mario World, F-Zero, SimCity, Pilot Wings, Final Fight, Gradius 3, Super R-Type, Big Run, Parodius, Bombooza, Ultraman, Draken, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, and Populous. So an incredible range of games at the event for people to try out. And Nintendo finally had a firm release date for the system in Japan, so launch day was set for November 21st, 1990, but of course it didn't go without its problems. So the system was way more popular than the stock Nintendo had for it. They had over 1.5 million pre-orders, but they were only able to get 300,000 systems ready for launch day, so there was a lot of disappointed people in Tokyo on the day that it launched. Thankfully, in the month to follow, they managed to get another 330,000 consoles, but it was still nowhere near enough, even though over 600,000 consoles sold in the first month made it the best-selling video game system of all time up until that point. And in fact, it was so successful and so popular on launch day, which happened to be a Wednesday, the Japanese government actually had to step in and ask technology manufacturers to not release game consoles midweek. So from then on, game console releases now have to happen on the weekend. And surprisingly, this time America wasn't the second country to get their hands on the next Nintendo system, it was actually South Korea. So if you remember in the previous part, I actually said that in South Korea, Nintendo wasn't actually allowed to sell their own systems. They had to go through a Korean company. So they actually partnered up with Hyundai, and just like they did with the original Famicom, Hyundai actually released the Super Famicom over in Korea as well, and they called it the Super Comboy to match with the Comboy that was the Famicom. It actually came out in Korea just a few days later on the 25th of November, and unlike the original Comboy, this one wasn't actually restricted to just Korean games. This one could also play Japanese games and American games as well if you changed the cartridge slot a little bit. Hyundai did actually release some of their own games for the system as well, and over the release of the system they actually released 34 official Korean versions of the games. And they actually look fairly interesting as well, because you would expect them all to use the Japanese box design, but about half of them actually used the box designs from the UK release, which is very strange. I'm not sure why they did that, but it's just interesting to see. And if you're curious about those box designs as well, I've got a Japanese and European release here. So the Japanese releases were actually mostly vertical oriented like this. This one's Jerry Boy, which is a really cool game by Game Freak, by the way. But yeah, this is how the boxes look in Japan. And this is how the boxes looked here in the UK. They're actually horizontal instead of vertical, and they have this Nintendo banner down the side. So that's the difference, and in Korea they actually had both designs, which is quite strange. And they're also different dimensions as well, so as you can see the Japanese ones are actually quite a bit thinner too. So after the releases in Japan and South Korea, Nintendo decided to start looking at America for the next release of the system. So let's move forward now to 1991 and the unfortunately very messy release of the Super Famicom in North America. So every year, all the way up until today, America starts with a massive trade show where all of the latest technology gets shown off, called CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. So of course, Nintendo was there in January 1991 to show off more Nintendo Entertainment System games and the Game Boy. The Super Famicom wasn't anywhere to be seen, surprisingly, much to many people's surprise. Well, actually, it was there, but it was behind closed doors, and only a very select few press were actually allowed to see the console. For everyone else there, for all intents and purposes, Nintendo was only there to show off the Game Boy and the original Nintendo. There was one thing announced at that show regarding the Super Nintendo though, and that was a launch date of September 1991. The month after, in February, it was actually Sony and not Nintendo who broke the next piece of news for the system, and that was the fact that they'd partnered with Nintendo to create a CD add-on for the console called the PlayStation. So at the next CES show, which was hosted in Chicago in June that year, Sony actually brought the SNES PlayStation with them to show off at the event. It was announced at the show by Olaf Olafsson, who was the president of Sony Interactive Entertainment at the time, and he said they'd been working with Nintendo since 1988 on this CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. And they announced that it would be available at the end of the year for $400. But unfortunately for Sony, Nintendo wasn't happy with their license agreement with the system, and I'll cover all of this in a future video dedicated to the SNES PlayStation at some point in the future. But what you need to know now in regards to the launch of the Super Nintendo is the fact that Nintendo was very upset with Sony. They didn't like the license agreement with the CDs, so they decided to completely split their contract and move over to Philips instead. Unbeknownst to Sony, they would actually announce this the day after. But before we move on, there's a very interesting piece of trivia regarding the exact system that was shown off by Olaf Olafsson at this event at CES. So the interesting thing about the Sony PlayStation is the fact that the prototype actually ended up in an auction in 2009, and it was bought there by a man called Terry Diebold, and it was basically a bankruptcy auction for the company where Olafsson ended up working after Sony, and he bought it for an amazing $75. His son actually ended up finding it in 2015 in the attic, and they put it up for auction and managed to get $360,000 for it. And since then, the system's appeared at various different shows and gaming events over the years, and people have actually managed to get it fully working with the CD support as well. So it's just so cool that this original system that was shown off in 1991 and was never supposed to see the light of day actually came back, and people can actually get their hands on it, and it is a real thing that exists. And And the transition between that and what eventually became the Sony PlayStation is such an interesting story, so definitely subscribe if you would like to hear that in the future. But back to CES now, and a look at what Nintendo actually announced at the show. They announced that the Super Nintendo would also be getting a redesign just like the original, from the same person as well, Lance Barr. The really cool thing is that over the years following, Lance Barr has actually released a lot of these original prototype concepts for the system, and you can actually find some of those original designs in this officially licensed book here that came out at the launch of the SNES Classic. And I couldn't actually find any of those pictures online, so I've actually scanned in what I found in this book, and I'll put a link in the description if you want to get those high quality scans for yourselves. So it's just so cool to see this and have a look at what I managed to find over the screen here. And there was also a bunch of earlier prototypes that were shown off in magazines around the time of the show as well, so enjoy taking a look at some of these too. And unfortunately, I don't actually own an American Super Nintendo to actually show you an in-person comparison compared to the one we got here in the UK, so you'll just have to make do with these images, and I would love to try and get one for myself soon. It's not something that I've ever really seen in the UK, because unlike the original Nintendo, Lance's design was actually only used in America. When it came out for the rest of the world, as we'll see a little bit later on in this video, they went back to using the same design that they used for Japan this time. And now for the actual launch of the system, and it's surprisingly difficult to actually pinpoint a day where the system actually launched in America. From what I can see, there wasn't any test launch this time, so it did launch for the entirety of the United States rather than just New York like it did before. At CES, they announced the date as September the 1st, but from what I can see online, there's actually newspaper articles that say the official release date was September the 9th, but I can also see some places that say that it was August 23rd. But even earlier than that, there's some newspaper articles that say that the Super Nintendo was available to buy as soon as August 21st, so I really have no idea. It was some point between the 21st of August and the 9th of September. During that rollout period, the Super Nintendo was available to buy throughout the United States. To me, it kind of seems like the system was just being sold as soon as the shops actually got their stock in and they didn't actually wait for an official street date. That's what I can tell anyway. And by the end of the year, they managed to sell just over 700,000 units, which is very good. But they still had a lot of catching up to do, considering Sega had already been on the market for about 2 years at that point with their 16-bit system. And as for launch titles in America, this one's also kind of difficult to pin down. So from what I've been able to pinpoint from adverts at the time, from official books, and from unofficial history books as well, there seems to be somewhere between 2 official releases at launch, which are for sure Super Mario World and F-Zero, somewhere between that and 11. So somewhere between the launch window of August and September, you could also buy Pilot Wings, F-Zero, Gradius, Populous, Super Bases Loaded, Super R-Type, UN Squadron, Super Mario World, Draken, Howl's Hole-in-One Golf, and SimCity. So that is the launch window for the Super Nintendo in North America. It's actually a very good lineup, and there's actually a really nice variety of different genres there too. Now we're moving to 1992, and the next region to get the Super Nintendo was actually here in the UK. And in April 1992, specifically April the 11th, you could go into game stores here in the UK and pick up this bundle here, which includes 2 official controllers and Super Mario World, and you could also get a bundle with just 1 controller as well. It was actually brought over here in the UK by Bandai, so Mattel wasn't anywhere to be seen this time, thankfully. Bandai actually took over distribution right from the start, and you can actually see Bandai's logo right there on the back of the box, which is always really cool to see. So I'm really happy to have this. This is the launch day version of the system. Here's the system itself. It's based on the Japanese design, as you can tell. It's actually identical to the Japanese one, as far as I can tell, apart from the fact that it says Super Nintendo there instead of Super Famicom. And as far as I can see, here in the UK, we actually had 5 launch titles. We had Super Mario World, F-Zero, Super Tennis, Super Soccer, and R-Type. And I know that because they were actually featured on the side of the packaging. You can see the other games right there. And for the announcement of the Super Nintendo in the UK, Nintendo Nintendo, as far as I can tell, didn't actually put on any shows for the UK release. It was actually mostly advertised in magazines at the time. So in January of 1992, a brand new Nintendo-focused magazine called Total was released, and they were hyping up the Super Nintendo a lot. I've actually got a scan here from the announcement of the Super Nintendo for the UK launch, and you can feel the excitement. I just loved reading magazines back then, and I would have loved to be in the hype of the Super Nintendo back then. Unfortunately, I was born a little bit too late for that, but I was definitely there for the hype of the N64, which we will cover in the next video. And now for the launch in Europe, which followed a few months later in July 1992, and you'll be very pleased to know that it is nowhere near as convoluted as the European launch was for the original Nintendo. Thanks to Nintendo setting up their European headquarters in 1990, it was actually a lot more streamlined this time. So all throughout Europe, as far as I can see, it was released at the same time, which was July 1992. And that's basically all I can see for the release in Europe. As far as I can tell, it released with the same launch games as here in the UK, and this time all of the carts throughout Europe and the United Kingdom are all interchangeable with each other. They all run off the same system. In 1993 and 1994, there was a few more releases for the Super Nintendo in various different countries. Let's begin first with Italy, who released in 1993. So, unfortunately, Italy was another country that had to deal with Mattel, who were obviously very bad at distributing Nintendo products back in the day. But thankfully, Mattel distanced itself from Nintendo after Nintendo of Europe was founded. But over in Italy, they weren't actually controlled by Nintendo of Europe. They were actually controlled by a different company called Gig, which took over Mattel in 1991. And they made their own commercials and their own distributions for the Game Boy and the Super Nintendo.
Solo con Nintendo!
And they were also tasked with selling unsold Mattel stock of the original Nintendo as well. The next region to get the console was Brazil, and that was in August of 1993. As I mentioned in the previous part, Nintendo was basically distributed in Brazil by a company called Playtronic. There's a lot of weird, dubious legalities around that brand, and have a look at part 1 if you want more detail about that. But the really interesting thing was the fact that they used the North American design of the system, not the Japanese or European design. So that was released in August of 1993. At the same time as the original Nintendo, so both the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo came out in 1993 in Brazil. And the Super Nintendo actually did a lot better than the original Nintendo because, like I mentioned in the previous part, there was already many clone systems for the Famicom and the NES in Brazil at the time, but because the Super Nintendo was a fairly new console, there hadn't been those kind of Chinese knockoff systems, so it did do slightly better, although it was still far too expensive for the majority of the population at the time. And it does seem like Playtronic really tried to get Nintendo into Brazil, but obviously Sega still had a stronghold there. I did manage to find out that Brazil actually had some Portuguese translated Super Nintendo games released by Playtronic themselves, which is great to see though. Now we're moving over to 1994, and the next region to get it was actually Russia. For the first time, they actually got an official Nintendo console. So what you need to know for now is the fact that the original Famicom was never officially released in Russia. There was a bunch of clone consoles which were released by a company called Dendy, who had been releasing clone Famicoms since 1992. But in 1994, Dendy was asked to visit Nintendo of America, and they were actually offered to release the SNES and the Game Boy officially in Russia as long as they stopped selling clone consoles and Sega consoles. And again, Russia used the Japanese and European design of the system. I can't see any information about how the games actually got there. I don't know if there's Russia-specific games or if they just imported games from Japan. Let me know down in the comments below if you know any more than I do. And the final region that we're talking about here in this video is actually Poland, and Poland and Nintendo don't really have a very good relationship, but let's see what happened here with the Super Nintendo. So obviously Russia and Poland are very linked in their history, and it wasn't actually until 1994 that Poland had any specific copyright laws at all. So as far as Nintendo was concerned, there was absolutely no point entering the Polish market until those laws came into effect, because obviously just like Brazil, just like Venezuela, Venezuela that we mentioned in the last video, just like Russia, they had their slew of fake third-party Famiclone systems, and that was basically Nintendo in Poland, although for the most part Poland was a lot more interested in the PC market, just like the UK and a lot of Europe was in the early 90s too. But once those laws were in place, Nintendo finally decided to enter the Polish market, and they did so through a Polish company called Entertainment Systems Poland, after they managed to form a partnership with an Austrian and Eastern European distributor called Stadelbauer. I have no idea how to pronounce that. But they were the Eastern European distributor for Nintendo, and they actually got the Nintendo system. I don't really think it did very well though, and it retailed for a very high price, and at the time inflation was very high in Poland, and people didn't have much spending money, so I'm sure for the majority of the Super Nintendo's life, it was basically non-existent in Poland, and people just kept enjoying Famiclones. And now it's time for the history of Nintendo's first fully 3D console, and this is by far the most interesting of all of their console development cycles. So without further ado, let's take a look at the Nintendo 64. And the story of this one begins all the way back in 1991. And just like the last part, this story doesn't actually begin with Nintendo, it actually begins with a computer company called Silicon Graphics. So Silicon Graphics were a manufacturer of PCs that were used to create 3D graphics and animation for film and TV and various things like that. They began making their computers in 1984, but there was one demo in particular in 1991 at something called SIGGRAPH, which is a conference that's held every single year for people who are interested in the 3D visual and the technology and evolving technologies basically. They were actually showing off a demo at this 1991 SIGGRAPH show, and it was basically a 3D tracking technology where you could wear a helmet over your face and it would be able to track your different facial expressions and movements. So of course Nintendo was very interested in this technology, but at the time in 1991 they weren't thinking about actually putting these graphics in video games. They were actually going to use the technology to make their trade show experience more exciting for the guests and the press that came to see their new games and consoles. So what they did was take this technology and build it around Super Mario, and Charles Martinet actually auditioned to be Mario for this particular event in 1990, the year before it was actually put on. And it's kind of unclear as to whether CES 1991 or CES 1992 was the start, but there is this amazing footage here of Charles Martinet piloting this big 3D Mario head at these trade shows, and he would basically be able to interact with the crowd, he would hear what they were saying, and he'd be able to interact with them as Mario, and it sounds really fun. And they actually continued with this 3D Mario head at these trade shows for the next 6 years following this event. And of course this floating Mario head would come back on the Nintendo 64 a bit later on as the title screen for Super Mario 64. Well, not quite, but we'll get back into that in just a little bit. Something else also happened with Silicon Graphics in 1992 as well. They were actually interested in getting into the video game market, but it wasn't Nintendo they went to first. They actually went to Sega and showed them off a few 3D demos at the time, but for whatever reason Sega wasn't really receptive to these demos. I was trying to find out online what these demos could have actually been, and there was this one that I found, which is basically like a 3D street view with the camera moving through these streets. And interestingly, I actually saw that Nintendo took that demo and actually put Nintendo characters in that demo a bit later on. And even more interestingly, and my mind has just been constantly blown as I'm doing the research for this video, but there's just so much cool stuff to tell you guys in this one. The textures, the models, and the skybox from this original 1992 demo from Silicon Graphics were actually used in Pilot Wings 64, which would end up being a launch title for the Nintendo 64. How cool is that? But anyway, Sega wasn't interested in the technology for whatever reason, so they backed out of the Silicon Graphics deal, and of course the Sega Saturn is a console that we'll cover in much more detail in the future. So Silicon Graphics tried to find another partner for their new game console idea, and of course they ended up reaching out to Nintendo. Nintendo accepted their offer to help them develop a brand new 3D video game system. So throughout 1993 they were working very closely together to get the specs in line with what would end up becoming a very affordable system, and it was finally announced to the public in August that year at Nintendo's very own Shoshinkai event, also known as Space World. This was the first time that Nintendo had partnered with a company that wasn't from Japan, so the public were kind of skeptical at first, but here's what they announced at the show. So Jim Clark told the press and the audience at the show that their Project Reality console, which is what it was codenamed at the time, would be able to harness the graphical capabilities of 100 regular PCs, and it would launch for a price of under $250. It sounded impossible at the time, but as we'll come to see in just a few short years, those initial statements did kind of come true. But they were definitely overhyping the system somewhat. They were comparing it at the time to the Silicon Graphics workstations, the Onyx workstations, which were used to make things like Terminator 2, The Abyss, Jurassic Park, and more popular films throughout the 80s and 90s as well. And those computers could actually cost up to $600,000. So the audience at the time, and rightfully so, were expecting those kind of film quality graphics to be shrunk down into a console that would cost $250 in just a few years' time, and also be able to run those graphics in real time as well. Obviously, looking back today, that is just completely impossible. SGI would actually end up making a cheaper version of the Onyx system, which was actually used for early N64 development kits, and that one still cost a staggering $100,000 at the time, but it's certainly a lot cheaper than $600,000. They also announced that in 1994 there would be 2 brand new arcade games that used the new reality processors, Killer Instinct and Cruis'n USA. And they also stated that the console would get a 1995 release date. They were also showing off some more SGI demos, which are obviously, like I said, way beyond what the N64 was ever capable of. But I did find something really cool, and that is the fact that this menu here, which was used in the SGI workstations to open up the various different 3D demonstrations, very closely resembles the main menu from Super Mario 64, and may have been a direct inspiration because these were the computers that Super Mario 64 was made using, so that was just a really cool little bit of information that I found. Next came 1994, and in January at this year's CES event, Nintendo was there, but they were, for the most part, just still showing off Super Nintendo games. There were actually 2 Super Nintendo games of note though. Donkey Kong Country and Uni Rally, also known as Uni Racers, actually were both created using the same Silicon Graphics technology, and people at the time actually thought that these were games running on Ultra 64, or Project Reality as it was known then, but no, they were actually just for the original base Super Nintendo. Silicon Graphics were actually at the show, and they showed off some more 3D demos and different scenery. There's a bit here where you're sort of flying around the Eiffel Tower and it's showing off different landscapes and environments all running in real time, and it was very impressive. And still today it looks cool, so it must have been really impressive to see this running in 1994. And of course people's hype was building for the release of Nintendo's next system, thinking about what could be possible with these graphics. Unfortunately, also during 1994, SGI as a company was falling apart at the seams. So we mentioned Jim Clark. He had a disagreement with another one of the higher-ups at Silicon Graphics called Ed McCracken, and they were arguing over the direction of the company. So Jim was worried about Windows approaching and taking over their market share, as Windows and Microsoft were getting more and more capable with 3D, but Ed wanted to continue running the company as he always had done, which, fair enough I guess. But this all led to Jim Clark actually selling his shares in the company and leaving for good in 1994. He went off to start Netscape, which actually became a really popular web browser at the time. But as Jim was doing all of the negotiations with Nintendo, they were very uncertain about their future with SGI. Could they still make the N64? So Nintendo's future with SGI was looking uncertain, but Nintendo had also just managed to get their hands on the Onyx workstations, and they'd started creating the software development kits, and they began working on their flagship title, which would end up becoming Super Mario 64. And work officially began on Super Mario 64 in September 1994, as far as I can see. And the history of the development and all of the different beta versions of Mario 64 is just fascinating, and I'll definitely dedicate a full episode to it. But here's just a few really key parts that lead up to the launch of the N64 here. So when they started working on Super Mario 64, they basically just used a plain test area with Mario and Luigi both running around, and they kept working on that until it felt fun to play. And a snippet of that area with Mario and Luigi running around in this test area was actually found many years later in some footage from Space World 1995, and that was the first definitive proof that Luigi was actually originally intended to be in Super Mario 64. And another way that we know that is true today is thanks to the Giga Leak, and there was so much Super Mario 64 information that came from that, including loads of placeholder graphics and models and animations as well. It's a fascinating deep dive into the history of Mario 64, and I would love to cover it in the future, so subscribe if you want to see that. Not much else happened in 1994 though, so let's take a look now at 1995 and the progress Nintendo had made on the N64 that year. So in January, SGI actually made an announcement saying that they finalised the specs for the system, and they announced it as running at 94 MHz, which is way more powerful than the PlayStation and the Saturn were. For comparison, the PlayStation 1 ran at 34 MHz and the Sega Saturn only ran at 28. Although it was much weaker than the SGI workstations that they initially compared it to. And in April that year as well, Nintendo announced in the Nintendo Power magazine that they'd actually been working on building up a range of developers and publishers for the system that they called the Dream Team. And we'll take a look at who they were and their output in just a little bit. And at E3 this year, this is when everyone was expecting to see the Nintendo 64, it was not actually on show at all, but there were a few little snippets of information that we can find from the show. So they announced a Japanese release date of December 1995, and they also said that more information was to come a little bit later on in the year at Space World. And although they didn't show off any more games or tech demos, they did actually show off the first design of the system, as well as its brand new name. It wasn't Project Reality anymore, it was now Nintendo Ultra 64. And interestingly, the prototype design of the console that we see here is identical to the final release. This is the first time ever, as far as I can tell, where Nintendo didn't change their design at all. And it's also the first time where everywhere around the world also got the exact same design of the console too. But with no release date in sight, gamers were turning their attention to Sony and Sega and buying the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn. So before we take a look at what Nintendo did to try and get people's attention away from the PlayStation and Saturn, let's take a look at this Dream Team and see what their output was for the console. So the Dream Team was actually really interesting. They didn't just focus on well-known developers, they also focused on some outside companies that had experience with 3D graphics already, which makes sense. Although there were some big omissions, and strangely, for a Japanese company like Nintendo, there was no Japanese companies on this list whatsoever, which was a bit of a worry at the time, especially for people over in Japan, and for people who enjoyed those kind of games. But anyway, let's see what this list consisted of. So let's start with Acclaim. Acclaim would go on to support the system really well, and they actually had a release game here in the UK as well, which was of course Turok, which went on to become a big series for the N64 and spanned many sequels, and it did them incredibly well. They also made a bunch of wrestling games which people really enjoy, and all of the South Park games on the system too. Next was a company called Angel Studios, and these were one of the ones that had some sort of 3D experience already. They actually worked on the 3D graphics for the film Lawnmower Man. For the N64 though, they didn't actually make that much. They made a few baseball games, and they showed off a game very close to launch called Boogie Boogie, which ended up being cancelled, and it kind of seems like a Twisted Metal style game from what I can see. The most interesting thing they did for the N64 was actually the N64 port of Resident Evil 2, which, if you know anything about the N64, that game is just incredible. So Nintendo were right to see something in the company, and even more interestingly still, after they left Nintendo, they actually ended up becoming Rockstar San Diego, which is really cool to see where that company got its roots here with Nintendo. Next up was DMA Design, and they actually made the Uni Racers game that we mentioned a little bit earlier, and they would actually make some really really great games for the N64 as well. They made Body Harvest, which was a game that came out very close to the launch, and they also made one of my favourite games for the system, Space Station Silicon Valley. And just like Angel Studios, they would actually go on to become Rockstar North, and they actually went on to make the Grand Theft Auto series. So again, Nintendo saw something very special with this developer, but obviously they didn't manage to keep them around for long either. Next was Paradigm Simulation, and these developers already had some experience with SGI workstations as well, and Nintendo actually tasked them with making one of the other launch games for the system, which was Pilot Wings 64. So I'm not sure whether they were the same company that made that street demo that I mentioned earlier that used the models. I assume it is the same company if they had access to all of the models and textures, but even so, it's really cool to see what a studio with the actual technological expertise could actually make so early on in the system's life. They also made loads of other games for the system as well. Probably the other best well-known game though is Beetle Racing Adventure, which is many people's favourite racing game on the system, and it's definitely up there for me as well. Absolutely love that game, and you could tell they knew exactly what to do with the N64 hardware. They also made the Formula 1 games here in the UK, which my dad absolutely loved back in the day. Next is Rare, and they were already one of Nintendo's best developers, obviously making the Donkey Kong Country series using the SGI technology. They went on to make some of the best games in existence. They made the Banjo-Kazooie series, they made GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Killer Instinct, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Donkey Kong 64. They were just unstoppable in the N64 era, and honestly, they made some of my favourite games of all time, so I'm so happy that Nintendo managed to keep them around for the N64, but as we know when we get into the GameCube episode next, Microsoft got their hands on Rare, and I'm still salty about that, so let's move on. Next was Sierra Online, and they were very popular in the PC space, and interestingly, they actually didn't end up making any games for the N64. There was one that they announced as part of the Dream Team that was actually cancelled, and that was a game called Red Baron. And this Red Baron game was going to be a flight simulator, as far as I can tell. Next was Software Creations, and they actually helped develop the sound system for the N64, which allowed publishers to use sounds more easily in their games, like 3D perspective audio and things like that. So that's really cool. They did also make a bunch of games for the system too. They made Hexen, they made a hockey game, they made FIFA, they made Carmageddon, and a whole bunch of cancelled games as well. There was Space Jelly, which I'm actually very sad was cancelled, because that was being co-developed by the developers of one of my favourite games called Plock, and I would have loved to see what they could have done in 3D, but alas, it just wasn't to be. There was a bunch of other ones which I'll probably cover in a separate cancelled games video, but the other interesting one was a follow-up to Mario Paint called Creator. And although there was a 3D Mario Studio, there was also going to be more of a Mario Paint style one as well, with some video editing features too from what I can see. There was going to be kind of a follow-up to the SNES Mario Paint for the 64 disk drive, which we'll cover a bit later on too. Spectrum Holobyte was the next developer, obviously famous for Tetris. They also didn't end up actually releasing anything for the N64. They said they were going to make a Top Gun game, but that got cancelled in the end. Williams and Midway are next, and they were an obvious pick because they made the arcade hardware for Killer Instinct and Cruis'n USA, two games that allegedly ran on N64 hardware, although, as we'll see, they actually didn't. They barely had any resemblance to the N64 at all. But both of those games would end up getting ported to the system, and Midway supported the system more than any other developer in the system's life and actually released over 40 games for the system, so they were a very good pick from Nintendo. Next was Ocean Software, and they only had a very small output on the system. There was 4 multi-platform games that they ported to the console, and unfortunately their only exclusive game was actually cancelled. It was a game that was going to be called Vampire Circus, and I don't really know anything about what this one was going to be. 2 more companies now, and then we can move on to some more history. So Time Warner Interactive were next, but unfortunately that company actually got closed down before the N64 even came out, so they didn't get a chance to release anything for the system. And the final company was one called Mindscape, and they only released one game all the way in the year 2000, and it was called Rat Attack, which apparently is actually quite a fun game, but considering that's all they managed to do for the N64, maybe the system was just a little bit too hard to develop for, and that is a running theme with the N64 all the way throughout its life. The next thing that happened in 1995 was in August that year, again at the SIGGRAPH event, which we mentioned right at the start of this video. This time, SGI was showing off a concept for a potential future game in the Final Fantasy series. This was a 3D rendition of Final Fantasy VI, with some of the characters fighting a big golem here in this battle arena. A lot of people at the time thought this was either running on the N64 or a prototype for what would become an N64 game, and magazines ran with this at the time, saying that Final Fantasy VII was coming to Nintendo 64. That couldn't have been further from the truth. This was only ever a demo that Square made to show off what the potential future of RPGs could be. It was never intended to be for any specific console at all. It was actually just a proof of concept and nothing more. The actual title for this was the Final Fantasy VI Interactive CG Game, and that's all it was. And another interesting bit of Nintendo history happened in August 1995 as well. They finally launched their own website, so that was just a nice little interesting bit of trivia right there. They also put out some adverts in magazines and newspapers telling consumers not to buy the PlayStation or the Saturn and to wait for the N64, because the wait will be worth it. Trust Nintendo. And then finally in November that year at Nintendo's Space World event, games were actually shown for the system for the first time ever, including 2 playable games and a whole bunch of games that played on a trailer on the TVs at the show as well. The games that were playable were Super Mario 64, of course, which drew in crowds and amazing feedback, and a lot of tweaks that Nintendo would have to make to the game as well in terms of the controls and things, because even controlling a character in 3D space was a very novel concept at the time that people had to try and wrap their heads around. And the other game that was available to play at the show was a game called Kirby Bowl, which ended up getting reworked into Kirby's Air Ride for the N64, but then that was cancelled and then it got brought back on the GameCube, and according to the reaction at the show, Kirby Bowl, no one really understood what that game was supposed to be, and apparently it was very early on in development and there wasn't really much to it. So obviously Mario 64 was the star of the show at Space World that year. And before the system even came out, Nintendo also announced the N64 disk drive add-on. At the time they called it the Bulky Drive, and it had an interesting concept, but as I'm sure you know, the DD just came out and failed instantly. But it basically allowed you to read and write to the disc, which was a brand new concept at the time, and you could do some really cool things with like terrain deformation, and the game would remember that forever. It was a lot more than what CDs could do, but it was also kind of unnecessary as well. So as for the games that were showed off in video form, they included the very first sneak peek of the next Mario Kart game, which at the time was called Mario Kart R. They also showed off Pilot Wings 64, which would become a launch title for the system. They showed off Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, which would be a launch title here in the UK, but not in Japan. Blast Dozer was there, which got renamed to Blast Corps for its final release. GoldenEye was shown off in its early form when it was actually an on-rails shooter instead of a first-person shooter, which is really interesting to see. Body Harvest was there as well, which was the game that DMA Designs was working on. Wave Racer, which would end up becoming Wave Race 64, was showed off, and this game looked very different to what would finally become Wave Race 64. It was a lot more futuristic, and actually had more in common with Hydro Thunder, which is actually a great game for the system too, but it's really interesting to see how this original version looked. And apparently they changed it because they didn't want that game taking away the spotlight from F-Zero X, which was also going to be a futuristic racer as well. They showed off Boogie Boogie, which was Angel Studios' cancelled game. They also showed off Creator, which was the other cancelled game that we mentioned, that would kind of get reworked into Mario Artist for the 64 disk drive. They showed off a very early build of Star Fox 64, and a lot of people at the time said the graphics really didn't look very good for this one. But as you know, by the time it got around to becoming the final game, the graphics were improved a lot, because Star Fox 64, or Lilac Wars as it's known here in the UK, looks amazing for the system. And most importantly, and the most exciting thing for a lot of people, was this very early demo of what would become Ocarina of Time. This was actually a completely separate Zelda tech demo, which just showed off this little fight and arena, but it was just a small glimpse of things to come, so the future seemed very promising for Nintendo and the Ultra 64. But remember we said the release date for Japan was 1995? Well, that didn't happen, and in January Nintendo issued a press release where they announced a new release date, this time in Japan for April the 21st, and in America on September the 30th, along with a new simplified name which was simply Nintendo 64. And they also announced in this press release that they were planning to release between 8 and 12 titles in the first year the system was on sale in North America. They actually ended up releasing 8 that year, so they did stay true to their word on this one. Although owners were still left very disappointed at the lack of new releases throughout the year. They also said they had to cancel the simultaneous worldwide release which they were planning because of logistical issues, and just the ability to get that amount of systems out at the same time around the world was just unfeasible at the time, so that's why they had the staggered launch that ended up coming out for the system. And although the release date for Japan was set for April that year, no companies had got any games ready for the launch, and there was still no Japanese developers whatsoever, so it was kind of looking like it might be a bit of a slow year for the system. The Nintendo 64 really was struggling to actually make it out of the door, because that April release date for Japan came and went as well, and Nintendo announced a new release date, this time for June the 23rd. But before then, E3 kicked off in America, so let's take a look at what they managed to show off this year. So E3 was hosted in America between the 16th and the 18th of May that year, and finally Americans could get their hands on the Nintendo 64 and play 3 games at the show. They could play Super Mario 64 again, which was an updated version of the game compared to what was shown off at Space World the year before. They also showed off Wave Race 64 and Pilot Wings 64, playable for the first time ever by the public. They also spent a lot of time showcasing the new controller, as well as some other games including the home ports of Killer Instinct and Cruis'n USA as well. And Nintendo went all out at this E3 and actually had the biggest space on the show floor. During the press conference as well, they also solidified that North American release date for September 30th. Was it going to get delayed again? We'll find out soon. Let's move over to Japan now and their actual launch day, finally, of June the 23rd. And the system launched with only 3 games. They were Mario 64, of course, Pilot Wings, and a Japanese exclusive game called Psycho Habu Shogi, which was just a basic shogi board game ported to the N64, so I'm sure everyone was just excited to play Mario 64 finally though. And it launched for a price of 25,000 Japanese yen, and it came with a controller but no game, you had to buy the game separately. And Nintendo managed to secure 300,000 consoles for the launch day around Japan. 80% of that 300,000 had been pre-ordered in advance and they sold out straight away, and the remaining 20% also sold out on day 1, which was a brand new record for game consoles at the time, and even beat the PlayStation 1, which had come out in Japan the year earlier. They had a lot more shipments over the next few weeks though, and within the first 10 days, over 700,000 consoles had been sold. Unfortunately though, as I said, development was difficult, and over the next 5 months, in Japan, they only got 1 more game for the system, and that game was Wave Race 64, and by that point, there'd already been people returning their consoles because they'd played Mario 64 and Pilot Wings to death, and they had nothing else to play, so they'd traded their consoles in, not because they didn't like the console, just because of the drought of software. So Nintendo was a little bit worried that perhaps they weren't releasing games fast enough, but even so, the system was finally out, and now let's take a look at how it came out in America. So are we ready for another delay? Well, actually it's the opposite. So in August that year, August 19th to be precise, Nintendo announced that the console would actually launch 1 day earlier than they originally stated. I have no idea why they chose to do that, it doesn't really seem to make much of a difference. But something that did make more of a difference though is the fact that they also said it was going to be releasing cheaper than they initially said. They initially said it was going to be $250, but in the end, they actually released it for only $199, which actually matched the price at the time of the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn, which actually launched for much higher prices. So that's really cool, and that meant that the N64 would be off to a great start when it finally arrived in America on September 29th? Is that what Nintendo said? Well, actually, if you had a Blockbuster near you, you could actually rent the console from August that year, which is really cool. And that obviously helped a lot more people spread the word about the system before it released. You could actually rent the console and Super Mario 64 an entire month before the system was even out in the States. That's such a crazy concept, but it worked really well for marketing, I'm sure. And as for that September 29th release date, well, I can actually see some places that released it as early as September 26th. So it kind of seems like whenever places got the console around the end of September, they actually just started selling it straight away. And just like Japan, they had 300,000 units, and they all sold out instantly whenever they became in stock. And by the end of the year, across Japan and America, they'd actually sold over 1.5 million units of the system, so it was off to a very, very strong launch. Obviously, all thanks to the hype around Super Mario 64, but there was a big problem because come Christmas that year, Nintendo just couldn't get any more stock for the system. So for the majority of places in North America, and in Canada as well, it launched at the same time in Canada by the way, the N64 was out of stock that Christmas, which I'm sure pushed a lot of families to move over to the PlayStation and the Saturn instead that year. But let's see what Nintendo did the following year in 1997, and bear in mind that it still hadn't come out anywhere else outside of Japan and America. Now for the launch of the console here in the UK, and here's our launch day console right here. I actually got it for Christmas that year, so Christmas 1997, and there was a photo that I saw of me in this house right here downstairs with this at Christmas that year, but unfortunately I couldn't find it in time for the video. There's a really cool video here from the BBC that was announcing the launch of the N64 for the 1st of March across the entire of Europe this time. Apart from France. We'll get back to France in just a little bit, but for the entire rest of Europe, it came out on the same day, 1st of March 1997, and it actually came with a bunch of launch games here because we'd actually had a little bit of a delay compared to Japan and America, so in Europe there was actually 7 different launch titles. They were Super Mario 64, obviously, and this is the game that I got for Christmas that year, my original copy, so happy to still have that. The other games were Pilot Wings 64, of course, Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey. I don't know how many people in the UK would be interested in that one, but it was an option, I guess. Cruis'n USA was another one, Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, FIFA 64, and Turok Dinosaur Hunter. So a great different variety of genres, but still a fairly small selection to choose from, and of course most people would obviously just want to get Mario. The actual launch in the UK though sounds like it was quite bad. I found this blog post from someone here from gamesasylum.com, and they have a story of trying to get the N64 console at the launch, and they couldn't phone up to pre-order it anywhere. People didn't know that it was coming out. They tried to go to Argos to get the console. They queued up outside. They had 2 consoles and no games on launch day. So he managed to get the console and no game, and then he managed to phone up Blockbuster and drive down there a few hours later and pick up one of 2 games that someone had ordered, but they decided to only get one, and of course they chose Mario 64, so he only ended up with Star Wars. And then he found it quite funny that the BBC said that the console sold with a 1-to-1 ratio between Super Mario and the system, but he knows that's not true because he was the only person apparently in the entire of the UK that got Star Wars with the system instead of Mario. But yeah, sounds like a bit of a disastrous launch, all things considered. And before the launch of the console, there was actually demo kiosks in various places in the UK. I can see that there was definitely some in Virgin Megastores and in HMV at the time as well, to get people excited about the system before it came out. Let's go somewhere else in the world now. Let's take a look at Australia, which also got the system on exactly the same day, but for some reason, they only got 2 launch games, just like America. They only got Mario 64 and Pilot Wings, whereas in Europe, we got the whole 7 releases. So that is kind of strange, especially considering with the N64 in particular. I remember importing a lot of my games from Australia before they actually came out here in the UK, so it's interesting to see how the roles reversed over the life of the console there. Despite the lack of launch titles though, it actually seems like Nintendo in Australia put a bit more effort into the launch of the system compared to here in the UK. They actually had a press event the month before at the Home Computer Show at Melbourne Exhibition Centre, where the N64 made its first public appearance, so people could actually go there and play the games a month before it was officially released. As well as that, they also had a travelling set of mobile demos that would go around to different shopping centres and major events in Australia and actually showcase the system. And from what I read, there was a bunch of N64s in the back of this truck, and you could play Mario 64 wherever they happened to be in Australia at the time, which is really cool. And again, the launch actually seemed to do really well in Australia as well, with a lot of stores saying that they were already out of stock completely by 11 AM on the day of launch. March 1st was actually also the release date for South Korea as well, and just like in the previous two episodes, the N64 was rebranded to the Comboy 64 in South Korea, and of course it was distributed there by Hyundai because the Japanese import ban was still in place in Korea at the time, although just 2 short years later in 1998 they would actually lift the ban for certain electronics in the region. So from 1998 onwards, Korea actually just had the exact same N64 as Nintendo in Japan, whereas before that it was actually the Comboy version. So the Comboy version is actually a lot rarer than the regular release there too, which is kind of interesting. Interestingly, although Nintendo decided to just release the Japanese system in Korea, they did actually have their own Korean translated games and exclusives for the region as well, which is still pretty cool to see that they actually supported the region as well as they did. But as I said, France's release was actually delayed all the way up until September that year, and there was a good reason for that. I don't know why it didn't affect the previous Nintendo consoles, but basically, I don't want to get too technical, but France actually has a different TV standard compared to the rest of Europe. They actually use something called CCAM instead of PAL. So the N64 had been designed with PAL and NTSC TV standards in mind, but they had to redo some of the components to get it to work with the French television sets at the time. So that was the reason for the delay, but because of that, the French version of the N64 is actually easier to do the RGB mod for compared to the other regions. In fact, strangely, the N64 is not actually RGB compatible in any region natively, even though the Super Nintendo was. But the functionality to make it RGB compatible was actually on those French motherboards. They just hadn't actually completely finished designing that before it was released, so it's actually really easy for modders to add RGB functionality onto those motherboards. Later on in France though, they actually stopped selling that version and just started selling the regular European model instead, so I'm sure those earlier France exclusive ones are actually a lot harder to come by these days too. The next region to get the console was actually Brazil on the 10th of September 1997. And of course, just like the Super Nintendo and original Nintendo and Famicom before it, this was released in Brazil by Playtronic and Gradiente. There's a little bit of confusion around which one of those actually released it or whether they're the same company. Let me know down in the comments below, because I know some Brazilians watch the channel and you can probably piece this together better than I can, but one of those released it in Brazil anyway, and it was definitely an official version of the console. An interesting fact about Brazil though, they actually had a Brazilian exclusive cartridge for just one game, and that was Mission Impossible. That came on a black cartridge for some reason. And also interestingly, Brazil was the only region, as far as I can see, that actually came with a game bundled with the system, as you can see from this box art right here that says that Mario 64 actually came packaged with the console itself. And I guess Nintendo felt like they didn't need to do it in other regions because it was guaranteed to be a system seller on its own. And apart from that, there is very little information about the rest of South America in regards to the N64 launch. Again, let me know down in the comments below if you come from that region or if you know any more history about it. It would be really interesting to find out some more. There's a few other regions as well where I really can't find out much information, but there's still some interesting bits to be discovered here, so let's have a look at Hong Kong next, because they've always been really interesting regarding Nintendo consoles. They actually got the same console as Japan, but the game releases in Hong Kong were actually based on the UK designs, which is really interesting because they were designed from the UK cartridges, but they're actually NTSC versions of the game, which are incompatible with the console that we got here in the UK. And as far as I can see, there is no official launch date for Hong Kong, so it just turned up at some point in 1997, I guess. Again, let me know if you know any more than I managed to find out for this video. Another region, which is even stranger, is India, and I saw online somewhere said India had a release date of 2000, but I also saw online that Nintendo has no involvement in India whatsoever. I can't see anything more than that, so again, let me know, does the N64 officially exist in India? Or did Nintendo just ignore you once again? And the same goes for Thailand as well. I could see some places said it might have got a release there, but I could also see some other articles stating that Nintendo also had no involvement in Thailand at the time as well. Obviously, China and video game systems in general had a very tough history and they were kind of banned entirely for a while, but Nintendo managed to kind of circumvent some of that by completely redesigning the Nintendo 64 as a plug-and-play system so they could sell it as something that wasn't officially a home video game console. And to combat piracy as well, they actually made it so you could download the games from kiosks instead of actually using cartridges or anything like that, which was a very interesting concept and actually quite ahead of its time in some regards as well. So in China, they actually got the Nintendo 64 in 2003 completely redesigned and renamed to the iQue, which of course would then go on to span a lot more Nintendo consoles using that brand in the future, which is another video that I would love to do at some point. But the iQue for the N64 is fascinating just because of how completely different to any other version of the system that came out worldwide. So Dr. Mario came installed on the controller/console, and there was also demos for 5 other games on there as well, so you could play demos for Ocarina of Time, Star Fox, Wave Race, and Mario 64, and you could also buy the full version of those games at the kiosk that I just mentioned. And in 2004, the year after, they actually opened it up so you could actually buy the games online and download them directly onto the console, which is really cool, and that is where the launch story of the N64 leaves us. In many ways, the Nintendo GameCube is the next evolution of the Nintendo 64, but it took a lot of trial and error and a lot of company mishaps to get to the point where we are today with the GameCube. So let's take a look now at the history of the Nintendo GameCube. Today we're taking a look at the development and release of the Nintendo GameCube, and this story kicks off in 1997, just after the launch of the Nintendo 64. So as I mentioned in the last part, SGI, or Silicon Graphics, who's the company that Nintendo worked with to create the Nintendo 64, were just falling apart at the seams internally. So Nintendo could see this going on from the outside, and they didn't want to partner with them again for their next console, which would become the GameCube. So instead, they had 2 other companies that also both formed in 1997 to choose from. So the first company that Nintendo were looking into was a company called CAG-ENT, and they were previously known as 3DO Systems, and they produced the 3D chip for the 3DO console that I've got right here. So in some ways, the GameCube could have been a spiritual sequel to the Panasonic 3DO. So in 1995, 2 years before CAG-ENT was formed, the 3DO Systems team had actually made a follow-up chip for the original 3DO called the M2. Originally this was actually going to just be an attachment to the 3DO, but they ended up turning it into a brand new console. The M2 was actually demonstrated at E3 1995, and it had similar power to the Sega Saturn, but it was a lot easier to program for. In December that year, 3DO actually sold their M2 chip technology to Panasonic, who would then go on to create their own M2 console. And then in April 1996, Panasonic made a brand new division called Panasonic Wondertainment, and that Wondertainment division ended up beginning creating their own M2 console, which would have actually had DVD playback in 1997, so it was way ahead of its time. And interestingly, I also found this concept picture here, and the controller looks almost identical to a Nintendo 64 controller. There was also rumours around this time as well of Sega actually acquiring the M2 technology and not Nintendo. So there is an alternate reality out there where the Dreamcast is actually made using the 3DO M2 chip instead. But in 1997, Panasonic decided to cancel the M2 console completely because they were worried about too much competition from Sega, Sony, and Nintendo, who all had their own brand new consoles out at the time. Konami did go on to use the M2 chip in some of their arcade boards though, so it wasn't all for nothing. So Panasonic owned the rights to the M2 chip technology and to the console creation features, but 3DO still owned its own hardware division, and it was that hardware division that was sold to Samsung in 1997 that would then become CAG-ENT. And then Kagent, using their understanding of chip manufacturing and hardware manufacturing, they created a third brand new chip called the MX chip. And this wasn't just a chip, this was a full console design that was ready to be licensed by other manufacturers, such as Nintendo or Sega. And it was this new MX chip technology and all of the other surrounding technologies that Nintendo was interested in. So of course, this sounded perfect for the successor to the Nintendo 64. So talks begin with Kagent, and Nintendo employees went over there to visit the team while Nintendo's legal division was trying to figure out a way of buying the technology from Samsung. So while the talks were going on about the sale of the company and the technology, the developers were actually already planning on sending out dev kits to some of Nintendo's biggest developers, including Rare and Intelligent Systems, and this was way back in 1997-1998. And they were targeting a launch date of this new console for August 1999. So it seemed like everything was going smoothly and it wouldn't be too long until Nintendo's next home console hit the market, but unfortunately, as the developers were getting ready to send out the dev kits and the plans were being finalised, Samsung decided to cancel the sale to Nintendo, and instead, a few months later, they actually sold the technology to Microsoft. So with that blow to Nintendo's future, they were back to the drawing board, and luckily, there was one other company that they could reach out to, so let's find out who they were. So let's rewind back to 1997 now and take a look at the next company. This one was called ArtX, and this one was actually set up by some former SGI employees. It was founded by Tim Van Hook, who was the Chief Technical Officer, and Dr. Wei Yen, who was the former head of Nintendo operations. They were the chief designers of the N64 processor and the architecture of the Nintendo 64 as well. The two founders had managed to recruit more SGI employees and start their own graphics company. These employees made the break from SGI to try and keep up with the changing trends in the tech industry at the time, while SGI was floundering because Windows was taking over a lot of their market share. And one of the first things that this new company did was actually start working on a brand new game console chip, in the hopes that someone would buy it off them in the future. Unfortunately though, just around the same time, SGI would actually file a non-compete lawsuit against ArtX, claiming that their new startup was using some trade secrets from SGI. So 1 year after ArtX's founding, in April of 1998, after the collapse of the talks with Kagent, Nintendo reached out to ArtX to try and form a collaboration. And a bit later on the 28th of May, SGI actually dropped all of the charges against them, probably in fears that they would lose against Nintendo. So in the end, Nintendo ended up cutting all ties with SGI just like they hoped, but they managed to retain all of the previous staff from the Nintendo 64 days. So finally, this looked like it would be the perfect transition from the previous generation to the next. But there was a lot of work to be done if they wanted to still make that 1999 release date. So now we're moving over to 1999, and at the start of 1999, March 2nd to be precise, Sony announced the PlayStation 2, and this was Nintendo's kick up the bum to finally announce their sequel to the Nintendo 64. So just a few days later, on March 9th, Nintendo first announced that they were working on a brand new next generation video game console. And on March 13th, IGN released a big article all about Nintendo's new console, with a lot of details about the specs of the new ArtX chip as well. And interestingly, this is also the first time when we heard the first name for what would end up becoming the GameCube. It was originally called N2000. And in this article, we can find out a few interesting bits of early history about the GameCube. We can find out that the release date had been pushed back from 1999 to a new release date of October 2000. But even at the time, some employees at Nintendo didn't think this would be feasible. They also announced some of the initial specs that ArtX had told them, including the fact that it would be a 128-bit system with a 400 MHz processor codenamed Gecko, and with an ArtX graphics chip. It would also not be compatible at all with the previous MIPS chip from the Nintendo 64, and also break in compatibility, and finally, in a lot of people's eyes, Nintendo was finally moving away from cartridges into a new disc-based format. Something else really interesting, which didn't end up coming true, I don't think at least, and I don't even know if this is possible today on a home console, but they were actually looking into making a NURBS translation program for the GameCube. So basically, NURBS is a way of modelling in 3D that doesn't use polygons, so you get really nice rounded shapes, and I know that Rare used it in all of their promotional material, and a lot of the renders that were made using the Silicon Graphics technology also used NURBS, and the end result is incredible, and it still looks incredible today. So imagine being able to play a game at that fidelity without the obvious polygonal elements to it. I don't think that ended up happening, but correct me if I'm wrong on that one. I just thought it was really interesting to read. And interestingly as well, at the time of this announcement, they hadn't actually decided whether the discs for the GameCube would be full-size DVDs or the mini discs that they ended up going for. A few months later, it was time for E3, and on May the 12th at Nintendo's E3 conference, the day before the event opened, they finally announced the name of their next console, and it was called Dolphin. They didn't show off any games or the design of the console at this show, but they did make a few more announcements. They announced that it was going to be a powerful system, but it was also going to retail for a mass market price. They announced that ArtX was going to be designing the graphics chip, which was codenamed Flipper, and they reiterated that it would be running on an IBM CPU. They also stated that it would be using DVD technology patented by Panasonic. They also mentioned that the Panasonic technology for the discs would also be integrated in their own products as well as Nintendo's, so that explains where the Panasonic Q came from a bit later on in the console's life, and I really wish I had one. It just looks absolutely phenomenal still to this day. But that was it for Dolphin announcements at E3. There was no games shown off, and it wasn't anywhere to be seen on the show floor either. But in the background in 1999, development kits were finally being sent out to some first and second party developers. And here's a look at some of those early Dolphin dev kits, and we can see the official Dolphin logo on these as well. I remember seeing these dev kits and logos in magazines at the time and thinking that it was just so exciting that we were going to be getting a brand new Nintendo console, and I just could not wait. They basically resemble PCs with GameCube controller ports on them, and later on, there would also be special dev GameCube consoles, which had slots in the top for a hard drive, where developers could actually switch between 5 or 6 games in real time on the system to test out different builds. And all of these dev kits actually only run on special development CDs, so you can't actually play regular GameCube games on them, and you can't run development discs on a regular GameCube either. So throughout 1999 and 2000, developers were getting their hands on the technology for the first time, and literally getting their hands on this technology as well, because I found some really fascinating looks into the first prototype versions of the controllers, and let's take a look at some of them now. So the first test controller here, which was sent out with 1999 versions of the dev kits, is literally nothing more than a PCB and some buttons on top to replicate pressing the buttons on the controller. And then in early 2000, the first official controller design was sent out to developers. This one's called DevKit Controller version A, and there's some really interesting differences here between this and the final release. So instead of having a D-pad on the left handle, it actually has a menu button. And it also has really long, almost Virtual Boy-like controller grips. And a different B button as well, which is actually shaped in the same way as the X and Y buttons, but it's in the position of the B button in the corner. And as well as that, the analog stick itself is also much bigger than the final release too. Here's the second revision of the controller that was sent out in mid-2000. This is version B, and you can see some very interesting differences here. So they had a D-pad finally added to the controller here, and it also has a start and pause button in the middle. It still has the wrong B button though, and it still has that big analog stick. And as you can see, there's different versions of this as well, with different speeds, and these refer not to the speed of the game itself, but to the polling speed of the controller and the associated dev kit. So as the dev kits were being built, the actual speed that the controller could be read by the computer was also increasing, so they released different versions of controllers which were compatible with different versions of the dev kit. Interestingly, around this development time, there's actually a leaked document that came from the GigaLeak to suggest that Nintendo was actually looking into making the GameCube more of a portable hybrid console, kind of like what the Switch ended up becoming, including the ability to actually dock it into the TV and take it on the go and use a flip-up LCD screen to play the games that way too. A lot of people have speculated that this was dropped because of the power consumption and the fact that the battery wouldn't be able to last very long in portable mode, but it's really interesting to see that Nintendo was entertaining the idea of a portable hybrid console all the way back in the late 90s and early 2000s. Another interesting dropped feature from the development of the GameCube is the fact that they actually intended it to have a stereoscopic 3D display as well, which I assume also comes from this portable version of the system, and Nintendo themselves have actually stated that the LCD screen would have had Glasses 3 3D technology, kind of like what we saw later on the 3DS as well. And Luigi's Mansion was actually built originally with 3D stereoscopic technology in mind, which is a really cool, fascinating insight into how far back some of Nintendo developments actually go before they see the light of day. And in April 2000, there was some exciting news for ArtX as well. They were actually bought out by ATI, who was a big computer chip manufacturer at the time. And they were actually bought out for $400 million, all in ATI's big push to get into consumer technology. And from that point on, ATI became business partners with Nintendo, and there's actually a flipper chip here from 2000 with ATI's logo on it. And if you've ever paid attention to the GameCube, you will actually see that ATI's logo is actually there on the front of the system as well. One of those developers that got the early dev kits was a brand new studio that was funded by Nintendo called Retro Studios. And at first they were working on 4 games for the Dolphin, including a game called Raven Blade, an American football game, an action-adventure game, and a car combat game as well. But Miyamoto visited the company in early 2000 and he wasn't very impressed with what he saw. So what he did in order to turn Retro Studios into one of Nintendo's most important developers is actually buy out the rest of Retro Studios from the founder to make them a second-party developer, and told them to start working on a brand new game in the Metroid series instead. And at that point, all of their other projects got cancelled and they were focusing exclusively on making Metroid Prime for Nintendo's upcoming system. One of Nintendo's goals, and ArtX's goal as well, was to make this system as developer friendly as possible, because like I said in the last video about the Nintendo 64, it was extremely difficult to develop for, and Nintendo lost the trust of a lot of third-party developers at the time. So they made sure that the GameCube was as easy as possible for developers, and they made some brand new pipelines in order to make that a reality. Then it was time for E3 2000 on the 11th to the 13th of May, and Nintendo was there showing off all of their latest N64 games, but there was barely any mention of the Dolphin. In fact, it was only mentioned for one slide during their entire press conference. But it wasn't completely devoid of Dolphin-related news though, because some of the N64 games at the show would actually end up being cancelled for that system and moved across to the GameCube instead. So we saw our first glimpse of games like Resident Evil 0, Eternal Darkness, and Dinosaur Planet, which would go on to become Star Fox Adventures, all of which were originally N64 titles, and it's really interesting to see how they looked before they were moved over to the next generation system. Nintendo of America's marketing director at the time though did say that the Dolphin was still scheduled to come out in 2000. They did say to look forward to Space World that year though, when the Dolphin would finally be shown off to the public. And that's exactly what they did on August 25th, 2000. So at the Space World show, finally everything was revealed. They had this incredible stage show where people brought out GameCube consoles to show off and have photos taken with them. The name Dolphin was dropped and the name GameCube was introduced. They showed off the system and the controllers for the first time. And here we can see the first look at what would become the final revision of the controller. Everything looks exactly the same as the final release, apart from that B button still doesn't have its final rounded shape. There was one interesting difference with this Space World version of the console though, compared to what ended up coming out. It actually has a little opening at the top where you could actually see the disc spinning around inside. And I actually really like this. I'm kind of sad they got rid of that. And interestingly, a Space World version of the console was up on eBay a few years back. It didn't end up selling, but they were trying to ask for $100,000. This was also the event where they first showed off the Game Boy Advance as well, and they were talking about the connectivity between the two consoles at this show too. They also announced at this event the introduction of the mini disc format instead of DVDs, and showed off the Wavebird controller, their wireless controller, for the first time too. And I think it was clear at this point that the console wasn't coming out in 2000, so they announced release dates for Japan and America of July and October of 2001 respectively. There weren't actually any playable games at the show, but there was plenty that was shown off in video form. Here's what they showed at Space World 2000. They showed a demo of Luigi's Mansion, which looked incredible for the time. They showed off Mario 128, which is a very famous tech demo. A lot of people think that it's like a lost 3D Mario game, but it was nothing more than a tech demo to just show off the power of the GameCube and how many different objects it could have running on the screen at one time. And it was a great showcase for the system, and it's a really fun presentation to watch. So if you do have the time, definitely check the link in the description to watch the full show later on, because I really enjoyed watching it while I was researching for this video, and a lot of the stuff they showed off back then still seems kind of impressive today, honestly. They also showed off Meowth's Party, which was like a Pokemon showcase for the system, showing off how many different objects could go around on the screen at once, and showing off the sound capabilities of the console too. There was also the first look at Wave Race Blue Storm, and the new Star Wars game for the system too, and also a first glimpse into Metroid Prime, which looks very different to the final release. And just like the N64, Nintendo can't help but tease a new Zelda title too. So at the end of this demonstration here, they also showed off this really realistic looking demo of Link and Ganondorf fighting, which of course was very different to what Wind Waker would end up looking like just a year later. Space World wouldn't be the final show of 2000 for the GameCube though. It was also showed off in November that year at a show in Las Vegas called Comdex. And this was actually an electronics show, and Nintendo weren't at the event themselves, but ATI was. And ATI showed off the GameCube here, along with a breakdown of the circuit board, because this was more of a technology show. But the most interesting thing about this version of the GameCube that was showed off here, it actually shows off an older version of the controller, one of those dev kit versions. Then there was radio silence until May of the year after, and it wasn't until E3 in May 17th to 19th, 2001 that the public could finally get their hands on playable versions of some of these games. And the full Nintendo press conference for E3 2001 is available to watch online, and it was so cool to see the crowd being so excited for Super Smash Bros. Melee. I remember being really excited when I first saw that as well. As well as that, they also showed off some Luigi's Mansion gameplay, and they had a demo of the Wavebird controller. They also showed off that same GameCube demo that they showed at Space World the year before, as well as Donkey Kong Racing, which was a game that I was so excited for, and I'm so sad that that never came to see the light of day. And they also showed off Pikmin for the first time as well, and this is where we heard that some of the textures were taken from areas around Shigeru Miyamoto's home and garden and the surrounding area, which I always thought was really exciting, and Pikmin went on to become one of my favourite Nintendo properties ever. So it was really great to see where it got its start at this show, and people seemed really confused by the concept at the time as well, which is kind of funny in hindsight. Another game by Rare that they also showed off at E3 was the original GameCube version of Cameo, which of course got cancelled on the GameCube, moved to the Xbox, and then moved again to the Xbox 360. So it's again really interesting to see where this game got its start as well. And they also reiterated the launch dates for Japan and America, this time being set to September 14th, 2001 for Japan and November the 5th for the United States. One more show before the GameCube finally launched, and that was Space World 2001, also Nintendo's final ever Space World show. There was Smash Bros, Eternal Darkness, Cubivore, Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, Animal Crossing E+, which was an enhanced version of the N64 game, which came out in Japan just a few months prior, Wave Race Blue Storm, Star Fox Adventures, Super Mario Sunshine, Zelda the Wind Waker, who actually had its first showing at Space World that year as well, and a lot of people were very mad about the new cel-shaded graphics, as I'm sure you'll remember if you were around at the time. But for me, the most interesting game shown off at this event was unfortunately also cancelled, and that was Kirby's Tilt and Tumble, which would actually use the GameCube and Game Boy Advance connectivity to allow you to actually rotate the game using the Game Boy Advance, and you would drop down certain parts of the level and end up on the Game Boy Advance system. And I was so excited to play this game, and I'm very upset that it never came out. And they also announced that the release date in the US would be changed from November 5th to November 18th. Now we're moving into September of 2001, and this time Nintendo made sure there was enough consoles for everyone. So unlike the shortages that they'd experienced throughout all of their previous releases, this time they actually had 450,000 systems ready to go on day one, along with 3 launch games. They were Luigi's Mansion, Super Monkey Ball, and Wave Race. And Super Monkey Ball is interesting because that's actually Sega's first ever third-party release outside of their own home consoles. And the console was actually only available in this indigo purple colour. And for the first month on sale, they were the only 3 games you could get, and obviously the public was a little bit worried that this was going to end up being a repeat of the N64, where they went months and months without any new games. It wasn't until over a month later when Japan got their next game for the system, which was Pikmin. And then there wouldn't be anything else on the GameCube for another month until the end of November, where they basically reset the system and had basically a second launch for the console in Japan. So on November 21st, not only did Super Smash Bros. Melee launch for the GameCube, but Nintendo also released brand new colours of the system as well. So they also introduced the Jet Black and Spice Orange variations of the GameCube. And they shifted another 200,000 consoles, and Smash actually sold 358,000 copies in its first week on sale, and managed to sell over 1 million in just 2 months' time, which was a new record for Nintendo. So this second launch for the system really already gave it a new lease of life, which is exactly what they were hoping would happen. So things were actually going fairly smoothly over in Japan, but in America it was another story. Obviously, the terrorist attack in September put a spanner in Nintendo's works, along with the entire rest of the country. So the country was obviously in shock for what happened on 9/11. The stock market was down, the economy was down, but Nintendo had to press on somehow. They had a new console to launch. So the ad campaign, with a budget of $75 million, went ahead mostly as planned. There were some plans for parties to take place in September, but they were delayed until October because of the events, obviously. So in October, they did actually host some parties in Hollywood with a bunch of celebrities in hopes of trying to change Nintendo's image and make them more of an adult-focused company instead of a child-friendly one, even though in Japan they were still making games for children and families, but America really wanted to change that perception. They also announced something called Cube Club, which were special week-long preview events sponsored by MTV, which would take place all across the country between September the 28th and November the 17th. And at those events as well, all the attendees would actually get one of these. These are special preview DVDs for the GameCube, and this actually contained a bunch of trailers for upcoming games for the GameCube, as well as some interactive PC features like downloadable wallpapers and icons and everything like that. And in terms of the launch games, the US actually fared much better than Japan. They actually had 12 games available at launch, and they were Luigi's Mansion, Super Monkey Ball, Wave Race, All-Star Baseball 2002, Batman Vengeance, Crazy Taxi, Dave Mirra's Freestyle BMX 2, Disney's Tarzan Untamed, Madden NFL 2002, NHL Blitz 2002, Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. And now with Japan and America out of the way, in 2002, Nintendo turned their attention to Europe. And the European release day was the 3rd of March, and there was a bunch of stuff that happened before the release here as well. So it actually had a similar marketing campaign compared to America, including the Cube Club parties as well. They were also trying to remove Nintendo's kiddie image from Europe as well, and there was lots of post-launch parties here in the UK as well. There was invite and press events, and if you went to one of these press events, you were actually given a goodie bag along with a shirt, a magazine, and one of these promo CDs here as well, which was very different to the DVD that you got in America. This one actually came on a GameCube-sized disc, which is really cool. So if we open this up here, this was actually a lot of people's first sight of what a GameCube game would actually look like up close. And you could put this in the computer and watch preview videos and download wallpapers and see screenshots of all the upcoming games for the system. And I remember actually getting this before the console came out here in the UK as well, and I was just enamoured by the pre-release screenshots of Star Fox Adventures. That was the game I was most looking looking forward to, and I still find it really nostalgic to go back and put this disc in and to see just how different it was to the final release, and just to remember the weird menu system for this and just how excited I was at the time. In Belgium and France as well, they also had the Cube Club parties, and lots of celebrities around Europe also attended these events too. And surprisingly, before the launch of the console, there was already a price cut. It went down to £129 here in the UK, down from the initial release price of £150, and this was in direct response to Microsoft and their Xbox console, which had recently dropped in price from their launch price of £299 down to £199, and because of this steep drop immediately, and I remember some people actually bought the Xbox here on day one, and they actually got a £100 voucher that they could spend on 2 new games for their new system. And also, before the launch of the GameCube here in the UK, in the Game Shop Game and Electronics Boutique, they were actually giving out these VHS tapes, and here's my original one from before launch day, and again, just like that preview CD, I remember watching this over and over and over again and just getting so excited about the idea of playing some of these games. They were showing off Sonic Adventure 2, Super Monkey Ball, Luigi's Mansion, I remember Crazy Taxi was on there as well. Basically a lot of stuff that I could have already played on the Dreamcast. I was very excited about playing on the GameCube because I didn't own a Dreamcast at the time. There was so much really exciting stuff, and this video holds a lot of very special memories for me as well. And the GameCube was actually the first console that I ever got on launch day as well, and there's kind of a sad story around that. I basically sold my Nintendo 64 and every single boxed game that I owned for the system in order to get enough money to buy the GameCube on launch, so I got rid of so many amazing games just to get the system, and I could only afford one game, and the game I got at launch was actually Sonic Adventure 2, and I could not have been happier. I absolutely loved the game. But Sonic Adventure 2 was just one of many launch titles here in the UK. We actually got all of the release games that were out in America, minus NFL 2002. And we also got a bunch of additional games, making our launch range up to 20 titles. And the other games that we got here in Europe also included FIFA 2002, Bloody Roar Primal Fury, Burnout 1, Cell Damage, Donald Duck Quack Attack, Driven, ESPN International Winter Sports, Extreme G3, International Superstar Soccer 2, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, which was the one that I chose, and Universal Studios Theme Park Adventure. So that was it for the launch in the UK and Europe, but there was a few more regions that followed shortly after. On the 17th of May, the GameCube made its debut in Australia and New Zealand, and they also had a pre-launch price cut in response to Xbox over there as well. South Korea was the next area to get its launch, and that was on December 14th, 2002. And interestingly, this was the first Nintendo console to be launched in South Korea under Nintendo, because if you remember in the previous episodes, they were all released under a different brand, but by 2002 the laws that prohibited Japanese companies selling in South Korea had been lifted, so Nintendo could release and publish the GameCube over there, just as they did in the rest of the world. The next place was Brazil, and again this was launched officially through Brazil's Nintendo partner called Gradiente, but this one didn't get a price cut and it was very expensive over there at launch, which is a running theme with Nintendo in Brazil. It launched for the equivalent of £157, which is very expensive for that region. And surprisingly, that is it officially worldwide for the release of the GameCube. It didn't come out in any other regions as far as I can see. But there is one more region that I wanted to talk about, even though it didn't officially get released. There are some leaked documents that show a 2004 release for the GameCube in China under the Nintendo iQue brand. And this was actually going to be a completely redesigned GameCube system, just like they did with the N64 previously. This was being developed by an outside studio called Broadon, and the development name for this was the Broadon Board 2. And this was a flatter style of GameCube that also had DVD playback functionality too, and the ability to download games over the internet, as well as playing them through GameCube discs, which were planned to be released in China. Obviously, this fell through completely, and Nintendo didn't have any presence presence in China with the GameCube at all, although they would go on to release an iQue version of the Game Boy Advance and the DS, so they weren't completely out of the Chinese market. If you're interested in the history of the GameCube and want to find out some more, there's actually some really great resources that have come out in the past few years. There's these Project Dolphin books here by Travis Nicholas, and this one in particular is fascinating because he actually interviewed some developers for the system, and there's some really interesting insights in here. And this one goes into the history of the console along with a breakdown of every single released game too. But if you're interested in the development of the GameCube console itself and the hardware, I definitely recommend the GameCube Anthology book here by Geeksline. This one goes into loads of technical detail about how the system was made, how the different chips were manufactured, all of the different versions of the console, and everything else you could possibly want to know. And if you want to do some reading online as well, there's a massive, fascinating blog post called A Dolphin's Tale, The Story of the GameCube by Emily Rogers, and this goes into every bit of information you could possibly want to know, right from the start, like I was talking about with ArtX, all the way through to the release of the system and beyond, and it is a fascinating read, and there's a lot to sink your teeth into. After the commercial failure of the GameCube, Nintendo tried to take a different approach with their next console. Let's take a look at what two GameCubes duct taped together with a new control scheme can do for the company. Let's take a look at the history of the Nintendo Wii. Welcome to my launch history video for the Nintendo Wii. This story doesn't actually begin with Nintendo. This story begins with a third-party company called Gyration Inc. So let's find out how they planned to start a revolution. So I was always under the impression that Nintendo knew what the successor to the GameCube was going to be right from the start, but it actually seems like the concept for the Wii landed in Nintendo's lap at just the right time. So let me tell you about Gyration Inc. and the surprising path that they took to actually working with Nintendo in the first place. So Gyration Inc. is a company that's been around since 1989, and they invented all kinds of 3D motion sensing technology, mostly for use in things like mice for doing presentations on the PC, and before that they actually worked in the aerospace industry as well. It was founded in 1989 by a person called Tom Quinn, and his original concept for the company was to make motion-controlled devices that would allow you to more easily fly aircraft. And he developed the gyroscopic motion sensing technology, which would take 10 years from his concept in order to get the patent granted in 1999.
One of the most exciting things I just got off with is I'm the patent holder inventor of the motion controller that was licensed to Nintendo to make the Wii.
And one of the early examples of this technology being used is actually in a motion-controlled mouse called the Gyration Air Mouse. And it would be used for PowerPoint presentations, and you could also kind of use it like a Wii remote to move windows around on the screen and to zoom in and out. And in fact, looking at this demo here, it does actually seem very similar to the technology that was used in the Wii remote. But in 2001, Gyration Inc. wanted to move away from the business aspects and try and focus their attention towards video games. And the first company they went to try and pitch their ideas was actually Microsoft. So they did a pitch in 2001 to Microsoft's Steve Ballmer. And you may know him as the very, very energetic CEO who is very famous these days for that developer conference from Windows 2000.
Developers, 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 developers. Developers, 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 developers.
And he actually loved the idea, and he managed to set Gyration Inc. up with a second pitch to some of the executives at Microsoft. But that second pitch didn't go quite as well as the first. In fact, the pitch went so badly and the people in the room were so rude that one of the executives in the room actually came up after the pitch and apologised to Tom just for the rudeness of the staff at this meeting. So they wrote Microsoft off, that just wasn't happening, and they turned their attention to another video game company, which was Sony. So they were thinking about Nintendo around this point, but they also knew that Nintendo was struggling a lot, not just financially, but also in terms of management, because there was some rumours going around that Yamauchi was going to step down as president, and they didn't really know what was going to happen. So instead of going to Nintendo, they turned their attention to Sony, and a meeting was set up with Ken Kutaragi, who was actually the developer of the SNES sound chip and the SNES PlayStation before moving on to becoming the developer for the PlayStation series of consoles. And it also sounds like this presentation didn't go very well at all either. Here's a direct quote. "We were in a tiny little room with a big PC projector, and Kutaragi comes in, introduces himself, sits down, and I swear this is true, he closed his eyes the moment I started showing my pitch. He never opened them until I had finished." And that is just incredibly rude and incredibly demoralising for the people doing this pitch. So Sony was off the cards as well, and I have no idea why the companies were being so rude about this fairly interesting technology, which a few years later Sony and Microsoft would both be trying to copy and come up with their own variations on. But anyway, let's move forward a bit later on to September that year in 2001, when they finally got a meeting with Nintendo. And this really is an incredible series of events that managed to pan out absolutely perfectly for Gyration. So in 2001, like the rumours suggested, Yamauchi stepped down as president of Nintendo, and in his place was actually put a board of directors. And one of the people who was one of the members of this new board was a man called Atsushi Asada. And he was actually friends with someone who worked at Gyration Inc. and managed to set them up a pitch meeting in 2001 in September, and Asada was actually there in the meeting room too. And here's some more quotes from how that meeting went. "About 20 minutes into my pitch, which was roughly the same one I gave to Microsoft and Sony, Asada stopped things and asked if he could have a moment to speak with his people. I was thinking, here we go again. They started talking, and right in front of me, it was going into this really heated discussion. I was told by Yoshida, who was also in the room, that some executives were resistant to the idea of motion controls, while others were completely sold by it. And then, in the middle of this debate that was getting louder and louder, Asada barked something, and then there was total silence. That was it. He decided to license our patents for motion control, as well as buy some of the company. So the fortunes really were in Gyration's favour, and they left that meeting much wealthier than they were before, and now also as a partner for Nintendo. And they were immediately set to work to come up with a new controller for their next generation console. The original design for what would become the Wii Remote was designed by a man at Gyration called Matt Prester, and he very kindly actually shared the original design documents for what would become the first of many, many prototypes for the Wii Remote. So the idea they came up with to begin with was this breakaway gyropod concept, and as you can see, it comes in two different halves, but they actually attach together to form a standard game controller. And if we take a look at some of the other slides here that they showed off to Nintendo around this time, you can actually see that it already controls very much like how the Wii Remote would end up controlling in this demo here of a first-person shooter, where you actually use your hand in order to control the gun, which of course was one of many selling points for the system. And here's some other prototype designs as well. You can see the first one here is obviously based on their existing mice that they used for the presentation technology. There's also this boomerang shaped one called the Sidecar, and the two-handed hybrid controller, which is basically just a regular controller with one side shorter than the other. There's also the traditional break-apart version, which is the two connecting together but also being able to be used freehand as well, and a bunch of other really interesting concepts and sketches and 3D renders too. It's so amazing that I managed to find this information out there online, so I really hope you appreciate seeing this very early start for the Wii Remote. And now, once those original concepts were out there, Nintendo themselves got to work with making a whole bunch of different concepts and prototypes for basically playing around with motion controlled gaming. So let's start off with this star controller here in the middle, which I just find absolutely fascinating and also hilarious at the same time. So Nintendo actually showed this off back in 2006 when they were talking about the development of the Wii Remote. There's an excerpt here from this book called Nintendo Magic: Winning the Video Game Wars, and in it, they discussed this star controller, so let me read a little bit here because I think it's very interesting but also kind of funny. It had a large star-shaped button in the centre surrounded by three smaller buttons and used internal accelerometers that let the player control by tilting it forwards, backwards, left and right. And its bizarre appearance earned it the nickname Cheddar Cheese from the development team. It was admittedly simple and easy to understand, but also far too garish. Miyamoto's team met with around 40 game developers within Nintendo bi-monthly to hear their opinions. They complained that it was totally unsuited to traditional games like Mario and Zelda. So that's a really interesting piece of Nintendo history, but there's so much more to go into here. They also showed off an interesting controller which would actually have twisted in the centre, as well as one that does actually look fairly similar to the eventual Wii Remote design, and this really weirdly shaped one, which is kind of just like a Dreamcast controller without a screen in the middle. And what's even cooler about these prototype controllers is the fact that in the Nintendo Museum that opened up last year in Kyoto, they actually have these on display as well, and I don't think these photos were meant to be taken, so hopefully Nintendo doesn't shut this video down, but I actually found some photos from the museum where you can actually see all of the prototype controllers for the Wii in a glass display cabinet, and not only does it have the cheddar cheese star, it also has an even bigger star which was on a blue base, also surrounded by 3 buttons as well, which I assume would work in exactly the same way. There's also a few other interesting concepts here that weren't shown off originally in 2006. There's some very strange ones which just feature discs. There's one that looks like a fidget spinner that just has 3 discs on it. There's another one that's like a plus control pad which has 2 discs on either side and maybe some buttons on the top and the bottom. And then there's one which is just 2 discs in a rectangle. I have no idea what they were really thinking with these designs, but it's very interesting to see nonetheless. And there was also this really interesting concept which I think would have actually done really well if it did come out. It's basically a GameCube controller design with a slot in the middle to put the Wii Remote. So basically, instead of plugging the classic controller in like you do with the final Wii Remote, you would actually dock it into the controller itself and then just be able to play games just like you would do on the GameCube, which I think is really interesting. And they also showed off a few different variations of what would become the final Wii Remote, and I also found the very first ever prototype version of this as well, which actually featured a really big analog stick right in the centre of the Wii Remote and no buttons on the bottom at all. And when they did finally settle on that wand-style Wii Remote design, it was originally designed to work with the GameCube, and I actually found some patents that show that working with the GameCube here, and you can see that it would have actually used the Wavebird controller attachment in order to wirelessly connect it to the GameCube here. And you can also see a very different design for what would end up becoming the sensor bar here too. There's also a few other patent designs here as well, one for that slot-in GameCube style controller, but also another really interesting one which we'll get back to in the next video when I talk about the Wii U, and this would have actually given the Wii Remote its own screen on the top as well, which is just absolutely fascinating that they were thinking about this so long before the Wii U came out, but that's for the next episode. And here's some more patent ideas for what would become the Wii Remote, and also the classic controller, and a very early glimpse into what would finally become the Wii Zapper as well. And it seems like the nunchuck attachment didn't go through quite as many revisions. There's a few here from the Nintendo Museum, and there's one here in this drawing, and here's a look at that GameCube version of the Wii Remote, nunchuck and sensor bar, which were actually used for developers to build their games for the Wii, and because the Wii is basically just an enhanced GameCube, people were actually making their games using dev kit versions of the GameCube that just had extra RAM, and a few extra chips that were added onto it to make it the equivalent of a Wii. So it's really interesting to see these early versions of what would become the final controller. And bear in mind, while all this was going on, Nintendo had made no official announcement regarding what the revolution would actually be, or what its interesting controller concept would be either. So let's move forward to 2002, when Satoru Iwata became president. The first thing that Iwata did in 2002 when he became president was actually to change the trajectory that Nintendo was going by deciding not to focus on competing with high-end graphics and furthering the technology, but instead to look at a new blue ocean strategy, as he called it, which was basically trying to get people who aren't gamers to join in the gaming community and to just grow gaming in general. He also set up a new executive board for group decisions as well, and there's an interview here from 2004 just before the launch of the DS that kind of explains his concept here, and also gives the very first sneak peek into his ideas with the revolution too. So he said in this 2004 interview that the industry has been able to build up its success by making games more gorgeous and more complicated, but unfortunately I just can't predict if it can keep going on with that direction for a very long time from now. Come to think of it, whatever future product Nintendo might make, it's not the small changes we're going to be introducing. Everything Nintendo is going to create shall become very varied and revolutionary. If we cannot come up with that kind of great change, I'm afraid people are going to get tired of it pretty soon. But at the same time, while this Blue Ocean strategy was slowly coming into effect, work on the successor to the GameCube was already in the planning stages over at ATI, and we can actually find out that thanks to some leaked documents from the GigaLeak, that the next Nintendo GameCube, as it was known back then, was actually just going to be more of the same. It was going to be a HD-ready console that just did exactly what Nintendo was trying to move away from, and it was planned to compete directly with the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. And you can see some of the slides here. They were saying it was a true next-generation console, and it would only be differentiated from its competitors by price point. And it was going to be a dedicated gaming device, seamlessly connect with portable devices, and the most interesting thing from this presentation, they were actually planning in 5 years' time, so in 2010, to make a portable version of this next Nintendo GameCube. And they even went as far as scheduling out the roadmap over the next 2 years until the system would launch. But we all know that plan didn't come to fruition, and Iwata did get his way, and from then on, everything at Nintendo changed. So, to put into perspective some of the struggles that Nintendo was facing by just continually chasing the same thing every single generation, you can see the sales numbers here, and they are dire if you look at it like this. Every single generation, without fail, did far worse than the one before it. The NES sold overall 62 million units by the end of its life, the Super Nintendo sold 49, the N64 only sold 33 million, and the GameCube, despite everyone's love for the system who did buy it, only ended up making 22 million sales. Nintendo had to do something about this, or they could already see the next console selling even worse than the ones that had come before. And Nintendo's future finally changed for the better in 2004 with the release of the Nintendo DS. Originally not released as a true successor to the Game Boy Advance, but more as a third pillar, as they called it. They were just trying to hedge their bets as to whether this Blue Ocean strategy would pay off or not, but of course it did. And we have a great quote here from Iwata at E3 2004, a few months before the launch of the DS in Japan. He went on to say here that the DS can tell you how serious we are about changing the way games are played. He also first mentioned Revolution as being Nintendo's next home console, and he went on to say, that same word, different, also defines our approach for our next home console. It won't simply be new, it won't simply include new technology. Technology is good, but technology is not enough. Today's consoles already offer fairly photorealistic expressions. Simply beefing up those graphics won't let most of us see a difference. So what should a new machine do? For both game creators and game players, a new machine must do much more. They must offer an unprecedented play experience, something no other machine has delivered before. Work on Revolution is well underway. When you see it, you will be excited because you will experience a gaming revolution. Nintendo felt very optimistic about the future of the company around this time, and rightfully so. So let's move forward now to 2005 and let's see where Nintendo's revolution went next. The next time the revolution was mentioned was in an interview in March 2005, again by Iwata, and he had this to say. Already you're seeing changes in Nintendo DS, which has a microphone, input pen, and touchscreen. We have a number of candidates for a new Revolution interface, but are not ready to reveal them yet. All I can say right now is that whatever we choose will be intuitive and easy to use for everyone. So around this time, they were still experimenting with all of those different prototype versions of the controller that I showed off earlier in the video. Next was a GDC talk, also in March that year, and at this talk, he mentioned that they were working with IBM to create the Revolution's processor, which was codenamed Broadway, because Broadway is the capital of live entertainment, and with ATI they were developing the graphics chip, which was codenamed Hollywood, because that is the capital of movie entertainment. And with the Revolution, they wanted to create a new capital of interactive entertainment. Whatever that means. He also said for developers at the show that the Revolution will be a place where the best ideas, not necessarily the biggest budgets, will win. which we can see looking back that he was referring to the fact that it would actually be a lot easier to develop for the Revolution, considering it wasn't using HD or some of the more modern techniques with game development. It was using tried and tested technology from the previous generation, which developers were already very much accustomed to. Next came E3 that year, and they were finally ready to talk a little bit more about the console, but they still kept some things under wraps, apparently intentionally, but I also feel like some things just weren't quite ready yet still. At this show, there was a lot of information shared about the Revolution, so I'll cover some of the more interesting bits right now. The most exciting thing, obviously, was the fact that they finally showed off what the console would actually look like. And they also mentioned the fact that it would be roughly the size of 3 DVD cases stacked together, and also that it would be able to play both new 12cm discs and GameCube games as well. Something else they announced at this E3, which wouldn't end up coming true, was the fact that it would also be able to play DVDs by buying an attachment which would go inside the console. That never ended up happening, but you can actually mod the Wii to play DVDs on it that way. And I actually did that at uni, and that's what I used to watch quite a few DVDs back then too. They also stated that it would use a very unique controller, but didn't elaborate any further than that. Another big thing that they were showing off at this event was the backwards compatibility, because not only would it be backwards compatible with GameCube games, which they hinted at in the Revolution logo, by the way, with the 2 different disc sizes, which I always really loved. I thought that was a really neat nod to the 2 styles of games it could play. But they also announced the Virtual Console for the first time as well. And they also announced a few new games for the system, even though they didn't really show anything. There was a kind of teaser for Metroid Prime 3, and you could see the ship in the background while he was talking about it, but there was no gameplay to be seen. He also mentioned that Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Online would also be coming to the Revolution. They also announced that they would be working on a variety of Wi-Fi enabled games for the console as well, and it would be able to easily connect to the internet as well. This E3 is also famous for the fact that Iwata announced that the next Smash Bros. Game would be coming to the system without actually giving any of the developers a heads up first. It was actually only shortly before the show that he'd actually mentioned it for the first time to anyone. And there was also a lot of trouble behind the scenes with actually getting Sakurai back to work on Smash Bros., considering he'd just left HAL a few years earlier to start his own company and distance himself from all that, so Iwata must have been very persuasive for that to happen. But I'm glad it did, because I absolutely loved Brawl when it came out. He also mentioned at this show that next generation versions of Zelda and Super Mario were already underway. But he didn't show off the controller. That was one of the mysteries that was left on the table for now. But people wouldn't have to wait too long to find out finally what that controller was going to look like, because in September at the Tokyo Game Show that year, the controller was finally shown off to the public. And here's what that version of the Wii Remote looked like, very similar to the final version. There was only a few small differences here. Interestingly, they decided to have A and B on the controller twice, which I always thought was a very strange idea, and obviously for the final revision they changed those bottom lowercase A and B buttons to 1 and 2 instead, which make a lot more sense. Also, the power button was a slightly different shape, and so was the sensor at the top of the controller as well. But apart from that, they were pretty much finalised with the design. But I found out something else very interesting from this TGS event, and that is the fact that Satoru Iwata was actually banned from doing any further speeches at TGS because he didn't tell them he was going to announce the Wii Remote at this show. In fact, the slides that he presented for the event before it was on were completely different to what they ended up becoming, and he had to actually publicly apologise for putting on a different show to the one that ended up appearing at the event. He actually just said, "I'm sorry about that, but it felt like perfect timing." So all of that was just impromptu Iwata being Iwata and wanting to announce the Wii Remote because he was finally satisfied with it, I guess. I just thought that was a really nice tidbit of information from the show. Anyway, that's it from 2005. Now let's move forward to 2006, and the year the Revolution finally went on sale under a brand new name that not everyone was best pleased with. The new name for the Revolution, the Nintendo Wii, definitely came as a shock to a lot of people, me included, and that new name was announced on April 27th, 2006. And I remember when I first heard this, I was disgusted, I was horrified. I loved the name Revolution. I'd been reading about that name for the past 2 years, hyping myself up for their next console, and then they would change it to this weird word that didn't even make any sense. I was so confused. I was so upset, angry. I didn't even know what to feel, but obviously the name finally wore in and I became used to it over time, but my god, that was a bit of a shock to begin with. I'd be interested to know in the comments how you guys and girls felt when you first heard the name Wii. And then a few months later in May, it was finally time for the big reveal, E3 2006, and loads of news about the Wii, about the controller, how it plays, all of the launch games, all of the games coming soon, all of the third-party support. It was such an incredible show, and I remember rushing home from school so that I could watch this, and I was just glued to the screen for the whole 2-hour presentation while Nintendo was just announcing mind-blowing after mind-blowing new thing for the system. This is really what cemented me as a fan of Nintendo and of the Wii in general, and was also one of the catalysts for me starting this channel as well. So let's take a look at what Nintendo actually showed off that year at E3. In a scene that still gives me goosebumps to this day, Miyamoto took to the stage and started conducting with a Wii remote in hand, and behind him, Mii characters playing different musical instruments and playing the Legend of Zelda theme tune. This would of course go on to become Wii Music, which is well known today as one of Nintendo's worst games they've ever made, but back then it was a very impressive showcase for one of many capabilities of the Wii remote. After that, he would continue conducting as the gameplay on the screen behind turned into Excite Truck, which is one of my favourite games for the system, and then Red Steel, which is one of my favourite launch games as well. And then Reggie took to the stage, who people already absolutely loved at this point since his first appearance in 2004. And he announced a release date of Q4 that year, so there wasn't much longer to wait until people could get their hands on the console themselves. They then showed off one of my favourite game montages of all time, with the Wii logo bouncing around and turning into all of these different ways that you could use the controller. And throughout these teaser trailers here, they showed off Wii Sports for the first time, Excite Truck again, they showed off Super Mario Galaxy for the first time during these trailers too. They showed off Aeroplane, which would eventually make it into Wii Sports Resort, Metroid Prime 3 for the first time properly, Wii Play, they showed off the table tennis minigame, they showed off WarioWare Smooth Moves for the first time, more gameplay of Red Steel, and finally, confirmation of the Wii version of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. So what an amazing range of games right off the bat, but there was even more to come. Reggie then spent a little bit of time in between this and the next set of game trailers to explain the name Wii and to try and get people a little bit more accustomed to it.
Okay, next, the name. First, we want to thank everyone who wrote good things about it the day you heard it. Both of you. But seriously, the response didn't surprise us at all. At first, every distinctive name sounds strange. Did you love Lexus the first time you heard it? How about IKEA? How about Google? Change is good. Wii from Nintendo means just what it sounds like. Wii. It's the sound of inclusion, the sound of every gamer you know and every new gamer who's going to join us.
And then there was another sizzle reel full of third-party games for the system who Nintendo said had finally got back on board, and they showed off so much stuff here. There was Dragon Ball, Disaster Day of Crisis, Dragon Quest, Fire Emblem, SpongeBob SquarePants, Disney's Cars, SD Gundam Breaker, Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam, Sengoku Action, Necronasia, Elebit, Rayman 4, which of course would go on to become Raving Rabbids, Super Swing Golf Pangia, Sonic Wildfire, which the audience cheered for, which would of course go on to become Sonic and the Secret Rings, Project Hammer, which was a cancelled Nintendo game, which I'd love to talk more about in the future, Final Furlong Revolution, One Piece Unlimited Adventure, Madden Football, and Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, which they'd announced the year previously. They also talked a little bit about the online features of the Wii, including a new service called Wii Connect 24, where the Wii would go into a low-powered standby mode and developers would be able to beam new updates to games directly to the console while it was asleep. That didn't quite end up happening, but I do have a lot of very fond memories of receiving different messages from companies and friends while the system was asleep, and obviously that blue pulsing light that came on when there was a new notification was really exciting back then. And towards the end of the show, they also brought up one winner of a competition up on stage to be the first person in the world to play the Nintendo Wii. And they got up on stage with Miyamoto, Iwata and Reggie to play the world's first game of 4-player tennis in Wii Sports. And then at the show floor that year, they had the biggest set of titles ever at 27 playable titles, and the queue for Nintendo's booth was just insane this year, with people waiting over 4 hours just to be able to get inside and get their hands on a Wii remote and try out some of these games for themselves. And that was it for announcements and pre-release things. Now Nintendo was turning their attention to the worldwide launch, and in 2006 it launched in 4 different regions. Let's take a look at what some of those launches looked like around the world. Starting of course with America on the 19th of November, and Nintendo actually closed 44th Street in New York to put on a 4-hour block party where you could play Wii Sports in the street on these demo consoles, and there was music playing, there was a DJ.
You're here in New York City and we're gonna get a Wii!
Even Reggie was there to greet some of the people waiting in line to get the Nintendo Wii, and people had already been queuing for days beforehand. And when the doors finally opened at midnight, Reggie actually put the first sale through the register.
There's over 2,000 people out there right now. We have over 2,000 Wiis here in the store, so we're going to have a great event. We're feeling good, everyone's been having a great time, and I'm getting ready to sell the first system.
And there's so many incredible photos and news stories from this event, and it just seems like such an exciting time to be a Nintendo fan and to be looking forward to the future of gaming too. And the sales after the launch in the United States were just insane, by far the fastest sales of any video game system ever. In fact, for the first 8 days they sold over 600,000 consoles, which equates to one Wii console being sold every single second for 8 days straight. That is just insane. And then next was the launch in Japan. It doesn't look like there was any crazy big events put on like there was in America, but thousands were queuing up around the country to get into the different electronic stores that were selling it on launch day, and online pre-orders for the console sold out immediately. Interestingly, unlike other regions around the world, in Japan it didn't actually come with Wii Sports as a pack-in title, and this is something that's been brought to light again more recently, where we found out that Reggie was actually very instrumental into bundling Wii Sports with the Nintendo Wii over in America and Europe. And he really had to fight for that, and you can see that his influence isn't around at Nintendo today, because the Switch 2 doesn't come with a pack-in game, even though everyone says that Welcome Tour should have been a pack-in, but I guess it's profit over everything else these days. Let's move on and see what the launch was like here in the UK. Before the launch here in the UK, Nintendo put on a tour across the country in over 60 different locations where people could go and experience the Wii before it was released. And the interesting thing about these events is the fact that they were all set out like modular house sets with different rooms all showing off various different ways of playing the console. And just like Japan and America, the console sold out here instantly, and some pre-orders weren't even being fulfilled until after Christmas, which put a lot of families under pressure to get the systems before Christmas Day. I found this news broadcast from the time from the BBC where you can see just the insane hype around the system here at launch. And just like today, some things never changed. There was already people buying the console and then putting them straight back on eBay for twice the price, of course. And of course, I've been talking about how excited I personally was for the launch of the system here, and I actually rooted through my magazine collection and had a look at some of those pre-launch issues here. And it was just so exciting for me back then to read all about the system from when it was first revealed. Here I've got this one where it announces it as the Revolution all the way up until launch day, and I've got the launch day editions here. There's this official buyer's guide. There's a magazine all about Mii's, which is something that I would love to cover in the future as well, because the Wii was much more than just a new console. It had a completely brand new operating system and so many new ideas for all the different software and different philosophies of game design as well, which definitely deserve their own episode. Here's the launch day issue of the Wii here in the UK. So exciting to see these again after so long as well. Here's another one from a few years prior where they're talking about the Revolution again. Here's another launch day issue from the UK, this time a preview of Red Steel. And here's one from Edge magazine, which I think has a really cool cover. Look how nice that is. And this is obviously based on that E3 trailer. So it was such an exciting time to be a Nintendo fan, and it brings back so many great memories, taking a look over some of these old magazine articles too. And of course I got my system on day one, thankfully, and I remember running home after school to play it straight away, and I was just obsessed. And of course that's when I set up my YouTube channel as well, and I used to go by the name Nintendo Wii, so, and if that doesn't tell you just how excited I was for this console, then I don't know what will. But there's still a bunch of other regions around the world to take a look at that came in the years to follow. So there isn't too much that differentiates the consoles in the different regions, unlike there was with the previous systems, which makes this kind of less exciting in terms of a launch and rollout, but it did actually end up being sold in a lot more regions, which is very good compared to the GameCube. So it launched in South Africa on the 28th of September 2007, and then it took another year to arrive in South Korea, which landed on the 26th of April 2008, followed by Taiwan on the 12th of July 2008. Argentina got it next on the 26th of March 2008, and then finally India got their first official Nintendo console release in September that year. And then finally Hong Kong got their version of the system in 2009 in December. And there again were plans for the system to release in China as well under the iQue brand, but just like the GameCube before it, that never saw the light of day. And unlike the GameCube, unfortunately, I can't find any leaked information about whether this system would have been different or not either. But that wasn't the final release for the Wii though. There was also this that's been sitting above the Wii box the whole time, the Wii Mini, and this is a really interesting console for a few reasons. First of all, it never actually got a release in Japan, which is very unusual for a Nintendo system. It actually first released exclusively in Canada, and it came out in Canada on the 7th of July 2012, and it was an exclusive there all the way up until March 15th 2013, where it came out here in the UK. And I've got the UK edition of the console here, and I really like the design of it. It's very much more toy-like than the original Wii, but I actually really like it. It's very sleek. I love the red and black colour scheme. It's interesting because the disk drive actually lifts up instead of using the insertion method. Obviously it's a lot cheaper to do it this way. It also removed basically every feature from the Wii that wasn't just playing games, but for what it is, I really do like it. And for comparison, because I kind of forgot to show it off earlier, here's my original Wii. As you can see, it has seen better days. It is just covered in very old, grubby stickers. It's lost the GameCube flap at the top, it's lost the SD flap, it's lost the stand, but it still works. It's still got all my original saves on it, and it's got all my original WiiWare and Virtual Console downloads, and I absolutely love it. I'm so glad it still works. But back on the topic of the Wii Mini, it did also come out in one other region, and that was North America, where it finally got a release on November 17th, 2013, and it was actually bundled with Mario Kart Wii there as well. And there aren't actually any sales figures specifically for the Wii Mini, but by working out what they announced originally and the final numbers for the Wii, which were actually announced after the original Wii stopped production, we can work out that roughly only 1.7 to 2 million units of the Wii Mini were ever sold, compared to the original Wii, which sold a massive 101 million, or around 100 million if you take away the Wii Mini. And to finish this video, I thought it would be really interesting to show that graph again that I showed at the start of Nintendo's downfall with and without the Wii. It's just insane the comeback that Nintendo managed to have this generation. And just for fun, and to show that the trend would have still continued, because technically the Wii Mini came out after the Wii U, which is very interesting in its own right. But if you put that in diagram form and get rid of the Wii, you can actually see that it lines up perfectly with the original trajectory that Nintendo was on. The Wii was a massive challenge to follow up, but it also makes for one of the most interesting development stories. Let's take a look now at the history of the Wii U. And I'm going to start this video with a fairly controversial statement, and one that I'm sure will surprise quite a lot of people watching. The Wii U is actually my second favourite Nintendo console after the Super Nintendo. I think it was very unfairly judged when it was released, and a lot of people didn't understand the possibilities of the system, and we'll find out why in this week's video. The concept for the Wii U as it relates to Nintendo actually begins back in 1997. And a third-party company came up with this controller add-on for the Nintendo 64 to be able to give it a second display. And this was actually before the VMU for the Dreamcast was ever first shown off too. Of course, this never ended up coming out, and Nintendo never properly had any involvement with it, but it's interesting to see that the dual screen system for Nintendo consoles was being thought about, at least by outside companies, all the way back in the mid-90s. Surprisingly, there is actually a working prototype of this screen for the N64 controller out there, and Hard for Games did an amazing video on it, so check them out in the description below to find out more about this. It wouldn't actually be until 2 years later, in 1999, at Space World, where Nintendo showed off something fairly similar with the Game Boy Color. And that game was a game called DT Bloodmasters for the Game Boy Color that was shown off in Space World of 1999. It wasn't actually playable at the show, and basically what it was a card game that used the N64, specifically the 64 disc system, and the Game Boy Color, and you'd be able to see the cards on the Game Boy Color while the people playing on the TV would have a different gaming experience. And that was Nintendo's first foray into what they would end up calling asymmetric gameplay. The game for the N64 was eventually cancelled, but that technology was moved forward to the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance with the link cable. And the joint venture that would create that asymmetric gameplay possibilities using the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance was a dual venture between Nintendo and Konami. It was called Mobile 21, and it used the same technology as the N64 and the Game Boy Color compatibility that we just saw, and it was also the same technology that was used in Japan to connect Game Boy Colors to mobile phones, which was used in games like Pokemon Crystal in order to transfer the Pokemon wirelessly. So it was a very interesting technology right from the start, but let's take a look at what Nintendo did with it using the GameCube and the Game Boy Advance. And this GameCube and Game Boy Advance technology was really the catalyst for what would become the DS and the Wii U in the future, so let's take a look at some of those early ideas. And there were some really interesting games released throughout the GameCube's life that used the dual screen feature of the TV and a separate controller with a screen in. Some of those including games like Zelda the Wind Waker, where you could get the Tingle Tuner and have a map on the touchscreen, something of course which would end up going into Wind Waker HD on the Wii U with all of the gamepad controls and features. As well as that, there was Nintendo's very impressive game called Pac-Man Versus, which they showed off at E3 2003, which was actually their big game of the show. It was a very bad E3 for them, but Pac-Man Versus is honestly one of my favourite multiplayer experiences ever. I was very lucky at uni to be able to play this properly with all of the Game Boy Advances and the GameCube and everything linked up, and it is just so much fun. So honestly, the concept was there right from the start. And of course there's many other games as well, like the Zelda Four Swords Adventures game, where each player controls Link using the GBA, and if you go into a house or a dungeon, you actually go onto the GBA screen and continue playing there while everyone else is still playing on the TV. And it was also during this GameCube phase that they first experimented with actually taking the games off of the TV to play them on the go and then pass them back again. And of course that ties into games like Sonic Adventure 2 with the Chow Garden, where you could put it onto the handheld and play it without the TV on at all. Or for games like Animal Crossing, which would allow you to design things to then send back onto the game. Or this game here, Nintendo Puzzle Collection, which was an exclusive to Japan, but this was really interesting because you could actually take the full games and play them on the handheld or the TV interchangeably. So Nintendo was already coming up with loads of ideas for using dual screen displays, and that went forward even more in 2004 with the launch of the Nintendo DS. Of course, I don't need to introduce the DS or going into the history of that console. That will be in a future video all on its own, which I hope you're all looking forward to. But in terms of Nintendo's home consoles, at the time they were already contemplating whether dual screens and touchscreens could actually be used as an interface between the TV and a controller. Here's an interview with Business Week in 2004 by one of Nintendo's senior hardware designers. His name is Kenichiro Ashida, and he had this to say. The DS had a huge impact on the Wii's design. We had the DS on our mind as we worked on the Wii. We thought about copying the DS's touch panel interface and even came up with a prototype, but then we rejected the idea, since the portable console and living room console would have been exactly the same. So at the time, they decided not to go ahead with the idea of having a touchscreen and TV interface. So now let's skip forward a few more years to 2008, which is 2 years after the release of the Nintendo Wii, and Nintendo had started coming up with ideas for their successor console, at the time known internally as Project Cafe. And at this early stage, there was two key ideas in mind. First of all, they wanted to revisit the idea of having a screen in the controller. And secondly, they wanted to bring back core gamers to Nintendo after they felt like they may have been betrayed slightly with the way that the Wii went into more of a casual audience. But it seemed like they really struggled to come up with a concept that could meet those lofty requirements. Apparently, during this time in around 2008-2009, the project was actually restarted entirely several times. Originally, the screen in the controller wasn't actually planned to be a massive 6+ inch screen. It was actually considered to be something more closely resembling the VMU on the Dreamcast, so it would just be a small screen in the middle of the controller that could give you a few little bits of interesting information while you're playing the game, just sort of like a little extra UI screen. And Nintendo had experimented with that back on the N64 as well, with a cancelled screen that would actually attach to the controller. And at the time in 2008, the concept of having a touchscreen as the screen on the controller was actually written off entirely because it would have been far too expensive at the time. I did manage to find a bunch of other interviews all talking about Nintendo's successor to the Wii around 2008 as well, and obviously they're kind of light on details, but there are some interesting tidbits here. There was an interview with Forbes first of all, where Satoru Iwata, who was the new president of Nintendo at the time, announced formally that they were already preparing for their next hardware. He added that the Wii 2 at the time was under development, but he did also mention that the hardware is just a kind of box that consumers reluctantly buy in order to play our games, and we'll see that that thought process was actually one of the major downfalls with the success of the system. He also went on to state that every future Nintendo console should be expected to have some revolutionary new features, just like the Wii and DS had done previously. He also mentioned that it would be difficult for Nintendo to go above and beyond people's expectations this time, considering the massive shift that they already took in the previous generation. There was an interview here from Business Week in 2006, just before the launch of the original Wii, and here we can get a first glimpse into some of the possibilities of their next system already. So they mentioned that once high-definition TVs take off, they would consider the merits of better graphics and more power, which obviously happened a lot faster than they thought it would. And they also said that they had the DS on their minds as they worked on the Wii. They thought about copying the DS's touch panel interface and even came up with a working prototype, but they rejected the idea at the time since the portable console and the living room console would have ended up being more or less exactly the same. From a later Iwata Asks interview, we can also see what they were doing internally in 2008 as well. Here's an interview between Miyamoto and Iwata, where he stated that it would be nice if there was a small monitor of sorts other than the TV, where you could always see the status of the Wii console. Iwata went on to say, "We had a lot of discussions and experiments, including things like where this small monitor should be." Miyamoto said, "Back when we proposed connectivity in the past by offering two screens between the TV and the Game Boy Advance, we were told that humans aren't able to watch two screens, but in actuality there are many situations where it's better to have a separate information display." And Iwata said that it's very common these days where you'll be at home watching TV and you'll also have another device in your hands like a phone or an iPad. And in terms of the jump to HD as well, Miyamoto had this to say in an interview about Pikmin 3 a few years later. "I felt like I wanted to go to HD sooner. From our point of view, once the subsequent generation to Wii came around, HD televisions would be much more common, and we felt it would be time to take our games into HD then. However, HD became more common about 2 to 3 years earlier than we'd anticipated. A main part of that was the prices for HD TV manufactured overseas had gone down at an unthinkable pace. And from a separate Iwata Asks interview, there's also more evidence here of them actually downplaying the role of the console itself. They actually referred to the console as a kind of stagehand, which they wanted to be as unobtrusive to the TV and the game experience as possible. And according to that, some of the designers of the console actually went about their work kind of solemnly, so it doesn't really seem like it was the best environment to be building a new system at the time either. They went on to say here that because of the Wii U gamepad, they adopted a policy of drastically reducing the characteristics of the main console, causing it to stand out even less, which, like I said, was one of the main issues with the marketing of the machine. They also had a lot of challenges related to the streaming technology to get the gameplay onto the gamepad with no apparent latency, but they managed to pull it off spectacularly in the end, thanks to a combination of different companies working across Japan and America to pull all of this new hardware together in time for the release, and it really is a technological marvel even today. It is so impressive to see the games running at such low latency, even lower than modern TV sets. And in terms of how the console could have looked, I also found out a bit of information about some of the prototype designs for the system too. So here's a few of those prototype designs for the Wii U gamepad, and these were actually shared by Nintendo in the Iwata Asks interview, so definitely check that out in the description. There was one that was made entirely from cardboard to test out the web browser, so there would literally be a piece of paper that you could pull as if you were scrolling through the screen, and that is just a genius idea to test a design of something. And there was also this very early prototype, which is literally just 2 Wii remotes and some analog sticks from the nunchucks attached to a tablet-shaped controller. So it has all the button configurations that you would need, but it is a very, very basic prototype. And you can actually see it shown off here in the Nintendo Museum in Kyoto as well. And above that, I can only assume that is another prototype for the Wii U gamepad, which is kind of similar to the final release, but it does look a lot more angular rather than the rounded design that they went for in the end. Skipping forward a few more years to 2011 now, and we finally got the first concrete proof that Nintendo was working on a brand new console, and this came from Game Informer on the 14th of April. They stated in this article here that we have confirmed with multiple sources that this new home console is capable of running games at HD resolutions. Nintendo is already showing publishers the system in an effort to get them interested and allow them plenty of time to start developing titles in anticipation for the system's reported late 2012 launch. And as we'll see, that late 2012 launch did indeed come true. A day later, on April 15th, there was another flurry of news articles. So let's take a look at what some of those had to say. An uncredited source indicated that Nintendo was planning to unveil a successor to the Wii known as Project Cafe at its E3 2011 presentation. Cafe was claimed to be a high-definition console with backwards compatibility with the Wii. There was also a few other codenames floating around this time as well as Project Cafe. There was also Nintendo Stream and Nintendo Feel, both of which seem to have some merit to them because you stream directly to the controller and the feel of the touchscreen, so it does seem like these sources knew what they were talking about, even at this very early stage. And there was some rumours floating around about the controller design too. According to our sources, the new Nintendo controller will feature dual analog sticks in addition to the standard D-pad and trigger buttons. It will mirror a GameCube controller in general function, but not in specific form. They also said that there would be a touch-capable screen on the controller 6 inches in size, and although it doesn't really take the form of the GameCube controller, it does actually have all of the functionality of one, so they weren't a million miles off. And just before we get into E3 2011, I just wanted to highlight this quote from Satoru Iwata, and it does seem like he could see some of the challenges ahead. Because people outside the company don't have an insight into our development process, when people see this for the first time in 2011, when this is revealed, they might think, oh, Nintendo's going to add a tablet to their console? I think that might be how people see it. And that is basically how people saw it, except they thought it was a tablet for the Wii console and not a brand new system. So let's have a look at that E3 2011 conference and see where the marketing may have gone slightly awry. I'll be completely honest though, before we get into this, I don't understand how people didn't come to the conclusion that it's a new system. I mean, they showed off the controller a lot, but I thought it was perfectly clear that these were brand new games running on a brand new console with enhanced graphics, enhanced resolution, and it also happened to come with a new control interface. I really don't understand how the confusion spread as far as it did, and I still can't get my head around why people still thought it was an accessory for the Wii, even years later, even though Nintendo cleared up their messaging. But either way, let's take a look at E3 2011 and see how some people may have come to that conclusion. So they started off the show by claiming that they hadn't yet achieved a game platform which was equally satisfying to the casual and hardcore audience, and they intended to fix this with their latest hardware platform.
Some hardware is seen as appropriate for only the most active, passionate players. Others, like we, they say, seem to attract a large number of more casual gamers. As an industry, what we haven't achieved yet is a game platform that is equally satisfying for all players. Yet, this is exactly what we intend to create with our new home platform.
They wanted to create deeper game experiences and also a wider appeal to a larger audience. And this E3 conference was also the first time we heard the name Wii U instead of Project Cafe, and here's Reggie announcing that new name.
You might remember how the Wii name began to make perfect sense once you started hearing it as Wii. But in thinking about a new Nintendo system, we knew the prevailing thought would be this. Yes, the game will probably still be right for all of us, but could it also be a perfect fit just for you? And the answer to that question is an emphatic absolutely. In fact, we're so convinced of it that we put that pronoun right in the name. So today, welcome to the world of Wii U. It's a system we will all enjoy together.
And along with the new console and a new name, here's the first look at the new controller. And you can actually see here that this prototype version at E3 2011 actually has quite significant differences to the final release of the controller, which we'll see at E3 the year after. After that, they showed off an interesting tech demo of this bird flying around a Japanese landscape to show off the graphical capabilities of the system, which I still think looks really impressive, and I don't really think any Wii U games actually came close to this level of realism, but it was still cool to see the possibility of the console. They didn't quite have any full games ready to show, at least not internally from Nintendo, but they did go on to show a bunch of game prototypes, including New Super Mario Bros. Mii, which was the first look at what a HD Mario game could look like, along with playable Mii characters. There was a shield pose minigame where you have to try and stop an arrow by moving the gamepad side to side and up and down. There was actually a few games which ended up becoming games in Nintendo Land showed off at this event as well. So we had Chase Me, which became the Mario game in Nintendo Land. We had Battle Me, which became the Metroid game in Nintendo Land. They also showed off Lego City Stories for the first time, which they were actually really hyping up as a big game for the system. And I've actually heard it's a really good game, but I've never actually played it before. They also had this sizzle reel here, where different developers would come and talk about the new console and their experiences with it. And basically what they were trying to get out of this was the fact that Nintendo heard the voices of the hardcore gamer. Apparently, although we'll see that that wasn't exactly true a bit later on. And then they shared some third-party games for the system, and it's kind of sad looking at this list. Let's take a look at how many actually came out. So Darksiders 2 was there, and that one did come out. There was Dirt, which was cancelled, Aliens Colonial Marines, which was cancelled, Ghost Recon Online, which was cancelled, Metro Last Light, which was cancelled, Tekken, which became Tekken Tag Tournament 2, Ninja Gaiden 3, which got cheers from the crowd. People were very excited to see that one. Again, it's a game I haven't played, but I really want to. They also showed off a bunch of games from EA, most of which would also be cancelled. So they showed off Battlefield, which would be cancelled, Madden and FIFA, which I believe did come out for the system, Need for Speed as well, which did come out, Harry Potter, which was cancelled, The Sims, which was cancelled, and Call of Duty, which did actually get a few releases for the system. And on the show floor at E3 as well, they also had a few other tech demos. They had this very impressive Zelda tech demo where you could move the camera around and change different things on the touchscreen and see a really impressive HD battle playing out on the big screen in front of you. It was nothing more than a tech demo though, to show off how a potential future Zelda game could look and play on the system using the bottom screen for item management. So you could say that during this conference, Nintendo kind of failed to get the message across with the Wii U, but that wasn't the only failure going on at this time. Developers were also failing to get anything up and running on the system, so around 2010-2011 they'd been given dev kits, but it really sounds like hell developing for the system. Here's a blog post that I found by an anonymous developer who went into some of the struggles with getting their games to run on the Wii U, and it honestly sounds like a nightmare, so get ready for this. So the first red flag was right at the start of development, before they actually got their hands on the dev kits. Nintendo came to them to try and sell them on the idea of developing games for the new console, and one of the first things they mentioned, and I'll read this outright, they wanted a console that was the same size as the Wii and wouldn't make much noise, so Mum wouldn't mind having it in the living room. It was during this statement that alarm bells started to ring in my brain. If Nintendo wanted the hardware to have a small footprint and to be quiet, they needed minimal fan noise, meaning that cooling was limited, which in turn meant that the CPU would have to produce a minimal amount of heat, which meant that the clock speed would have to be kept low. And it turns out that the CPU would actually be significantly slower than the Xbox 360's CPU, which came out 6 or 7 years earlier at this point in time. After that meeting, a lot of emails went back to Nintendo for feedback. It was almost a universal answer that it wasn't going to be powerful enough to run next-gen engines, and it might even struggle to do current-gen PS3 and Xbox 360 titles. They even struggled to get the dev kits to do simple basic tasks. And they said that Nintendo had provided an integration of their development tools into Visual Studio, which is the standard for game development, but it didn't work. Not even close. So they spent a lot of back and forth with Nintendo trying to get this Visual Studio integration working so they could actually start developing games for the console. Compilation times were really slow even for minor changes. Then it had to do a link step, at which point you could happily get up, make a cup of tea, have a chat and get back to your desk before the link was complete. The interface was clunky, it was very slow to use, and if you made the mistake of actually clicking on any code, it would pause and retrieve all of the values for all of the variables that you've clicked, which might take a minute or more to come back. Over the course of the next 6 months, they received multiple different development kits in a variety of colours, none of which seemed to reveal why they were different from the previous one. They also ran into a lot of issues with the very minimal documentation. They would try and ask their Nintendo support team, but they didn't know the answers, so they went to Nintendo of Japan, and it took about a week to get a reply every time they had a question. After about a week of chasing, we heard back from the support team, and they had received an answer from Japan, which they emailed to us. The reply was just a few sentences of very broken English, and didn't really answer the question that they'd asked in the first place. Any questions that they sent had to be sent off for translation in Japanese and then sent to the developers, who replied, and then the replies were translated back into English and then sent back to them. With time zone differences and delays in translating, this could take a week to just get an answer to a simple question. They also had many issues getting the online functionality to work as well, and during one of these interviews with Nintendo, they were actually told to stop asking about how it compares to PSN and Xbox Live because the developers at Nintendo had never used those systems before. That is just mind-boggling. How can you prepare to make a new system using these technologies if you don't have anything to compare it to? They were definitely aware of all of the issues and the confusion from that E3 2011 conference though, because in Reggie's book here, Disrupting the Game, he actually talks a little bit about it, so let me read a little bit from here now. We announced the new system, Wii U, in June 2011 at E3. Initial reaction was positive, but there was also some confusion whether this was a true new system or just a new controller for the existing Wii. We defined the overall concept, but didn't show real games that highlighted the system or its capabilities. Nintendo fans discussed and debated these issues avidly for a full year until E3 2012. We were aware of this buzz and decided to communicate the benefits of Wii U aggressively. We created a globally streamed presentation that reached millions of consumers before the trade show even began. The content went deep into our approach and highlighted our quality of life features for the new system. During the actual E3 event itself, we highlighted all the great content coming to the Wii U system. Nintendo fan favourites such as Pikmin, Super Mario and Zelda were demoed or had breathtaking trailers shown. The following week, I was highlighting Wii U on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon. We were generating a huge amount of positive buzz, and we had strong initial sales. But even with all of that new marketing effort, it still seemed like there was a lot of confusion out there around the new console. But anyway, all of that aside, let's move forward now to 2012 and take a look at their next E3 conference. Just before the E3 conference, there was actually a separate Nintendo Direct hosted by Satoru Iwata where he went over some of the new designs to the Wii U gamepad, along with its name, and some of the philosophy behind the console too. It's a really interesting watch to see what Nintendo was thinking at this time, and how some of those ideas eventually came together with the Switch a few years later. Interestingly, he said that a lot of the ideas for the Wii U came from a book called Alone Together. And it was this book about human emotions and philosophies that made him design the Wii U to be a lot more of a social system. And it was at this show as well where Miiverse was first shown off for the same time, and I have to say that the concept of Miiverse was absolutely fantastic, and I loved using it, and I'm so sad that Nintendo has basically stripped out all of the fun social features from their consoles, and it really does make me sad because Miiverse was amazing. I used it so much. I loved seeing everyone's drawings, I loved all of the game integrations, and this announcement video is just so much fun to watch even today. And then it was time for E3 2012, and did they do a better job at marketing the system this year? Not really, but honestly I still don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be online, so let's take a look at what they showed off at this year's show. They reiterated the design concept for the Wii U and sold it as this brand new revolutionary idea where they would take the best of handheld gaming and console gaming and merge the two in a really unique and interesting way that would make developers want to make some really unique games for the system, as well as it being a centerpiece of living rooms around the world. Miyamoto came on stage and did a demo for Pikmin 3, which is quite possibly my favourite Nintendo game of all time, so it was so much fun to see this announcement, and Miyamoto looks like he's having an incredible time on the stage as well, with a little Pikmin in his pocket, which is just so much fun. And I honestly love Pikmin 3, and the Switch port really doesn't do the game justice. You need to play it on the Wii U with the gamepad and the Wii Remote, the way it was designed to be played. It is just absolutely perfect, and it really is the perfect example of the dual screens working together simultaneously while also giving you completely different perspectives of the game and enhancing the gameplay as well, in my opinion. It honestly was mind-blowing at the time, and I really don't think any game since has come close to the ingenuity of that control scheme for Pikmin 3. It really was groundbreaking, but no one really saw it that way at the time. They also made it very clear at this show that it was a new console and a new screen. Reggie made absolutely certain of that. They even redid all of the promotional artwork, including how it would end up on the eventual box for the system with the console right next to the controller, so there could be no more confusion that it was just an add-on for the Wii. But apparently, even at this show, people were still confused. Even in the comments for the show at E3, I just don't understand, were people just not paying any attention? They also went over Miiverse again here, as well as an overview of the gamepad, and at the end they also showed off Nintendo Land properly for the first time, and it didn't end with a big reveal of some future game. The show just ended with fireworks, which left a lot of people a little bit underwhelmed at this conference, myself included at the time. I was really expecting to see the next Zelda game or Metroid, but no, we just got fireworks. And that was basically it for marketing before the system came out. The ending to that show was actually going to be very different. Here's Kit and Krista explaining why they made that change and how awkward it was, and also how last minute it was too.
The idea here was we need a new ending for this presentation.
Yeah.
Do you remember what the original ending was?
The original ending was just to end like on a trailer, I believe, of Nintendo Land.
Okay.
But the trailer that was cut was a little bit lackluster.
Yeah.
But we need to have something, but we don't got it. What can we cobble together? It was the night before.
Right.
It was like 4 p.m.
Yeah. So I walked in there.
Yeah, so what they decided on, so before the original ending was end on the trailer. And I think Reggie was going to be the last person that was on stage in the original ending. But instead, they trotted out poor Mr. Iguchi, who was leading up development for Nintendo Land. He wasn't expecting to go on stage.
Yeah.
TBH. At the 11th hour. No, this was literally like 4 p.m. and the press conference was 9 a.m. the next day.
Right. First thing.
So you basically have to make the change, recut the videos, and then rehearse.
Rehearse it.
All night.
Get it perfect.
So the poor man was probably up for until what, ungodly hour, trying to get this right.
Before the release of the console, there is one more show that I wanted to mention regarding the Wii U, and that was Gamescom that year. And although Nintendo themselves weren't there, Ubisoft were there, and they were showing off a bunch of games, including a new Rabbids game called Rabbids Land, and Zombie U, which was playable for the public at the show as well. And I actually went to that show, and this was the first Nintendo console that I actually got my hands on before launch. And I played Rabbids and I played Zombie U at the show, and I was just absolutely blown away, and my mind was just racing with the possibilities of what the Wii U and the controller could do. It really did feel like I was in the minority with this though, which is just so sad because it really did have so much potential, but people just, for whatever reason, just couldn't see that. And it was really frustrating because I really wanted to sing its praises, and I did so on YouTube at the time, and I spoke to a lot of people that played it, and they really enjoyed it, but other people outside of the Nintendo bubble just really couldn't see the appeal of it, unfortunately. Nintendo themselves did also feel like people needed to get their hands on the console and experience it in person to actually understand its capabilities. So throughout the summer of 2012 in America, Nintendo hosted preview events where people could go hands-on with the console before launch, and they also uploaded this video to YouTube where they announced their plans for the rollout, as well as the fact that they would be publishing Bayonetta 2, which was the first time that we'd heard from that game as well. And now let's take a look at the launch of the system and the insane amount of launch games. Nintendo were not lying when they went out to basically every big publisher and got as many games into people's hands for the launch as possible. The console actually launched first in North America, not Japan this time. So in North America and Canada, it launched on November 18th with a massive 29 launch games, which was by far the biggest in Nintendo's history. A lot of the games aren't really ones that appeal to me, but there is no denying that this is a great range of different games and different genres. There was honestly something for everyone. And you could really see that Nintendo was pushing to get the hardcore gamer back to Nintendo's consoles, and they really had the support of third-party developers from the start. So let's take a look at what those games were. We got Assassin's Creed 3, Batman Arkham City Armored Edition, Ben 10 Omniverse, Call of Duty Black Ops 2, Darksiders 2, ESPN Sports Connection, Epic Mickey The Power of 2, FIFA 13, Funky Barn, Game Party Champions, Just Dance 4, Madden NFL 13, Mass Effect 3 Special Edition, NBA 2K13, New Super Mario Bros. U, Ninja Gaiden 3 Razor's Edge, Nintendo Land, Rabbids Land, Scribblenauts Unlimited, Sing Party, Skylanders Giants, Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, Tank Tank Tank, Tekken Tag Tournament 2 Wii U Edition, Transformers Prime the Game, Warriors Orichi 3 Hyper, Wipeout 3, Your Shape Fitness Evolved 2013, and Zombie U. That is an insane launch lineup. It launched just a few days later here in the UK on November 30th, as well as the rest of Europe, and it didn't have quite as many launch titles as America. Some of those more America-centric games didn't get a release here at launch, but we did get all of the main games here, and I got my system on day one as well. And here's the launch games that I got with the system. I got Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, which I absolutely loved. Still think it's the best Sonic racing game to this day. I also got New Super Mario Bros. U, of course, and 100% completed it within the first few days that I got it. Obviously Nintendo Land, because it came with the console, and it was just such a joy to play this. And at the time, the Wii U for me came out at the perfect time where I had some money to buy the games, and I was also living at uni with friends who could come around and play on the console, and they did that a lot with Nintendo Land. It was so much fun, and I really do think that everyone I played it with really understood the appeal of the asymmetric multiplayer. We had so much fun playing Nintendo Land back then. And the main big single player game for me was Zombie U, and I absolutely loved this game as well. And I honestly loved everything about the Wii U, and I was so sad to see the reception that it was getting at the time, because I really think it deserved more love than it got. And I know we're skipping ahead a little bit now, but during the Wii U era, I actually worked for Nintendo on a few occasions as well to demo the system to people at various events. There was a gaming event that I went to in London, and we were showing off games like Wonderful 101, Bayonetta 2, Mario Kart 8 when that was first coming out, and a bunch of indie games as well. And honestly, every single person who came up to me said that Nintendo was by far the best game company, and they had the best games at the show. So honestly, everyone who played the Wii U absolutely loved it, just no one bought it. And I also got to work with Nintendo a bit later on as well to show off Mario Maker in Smith toy shops. And it was so much fun to see the kids and their parents playing Mario Maker and just really understanding. The kids just understood it instantly. The concept of drawing the levels out on the gamepad and then sending them to the TV to play, so their parents who were watching them could actually see them playing their own creations. And Mario Maker 2 on the Switch really didn't come close to the interface of the Wii U game, in my opinion. It really worked so well designing it, especially with the stylus as well. It's just so much more precise and so much more fun. And then being able to play it on the TV without having to go up and actually dock the system, it's just so much better. I really don't understand. I know I'm going on and on about it in this video, but I really don't understand why people didn't get the appeal of the Wii U. It really does make me kind of upset, honestly. But anyway, moving forward a few months to the launch in Japan, and they got even less games than the rest of the world. They only got a few of the bigger third-party titles, as well as one that came out for the launch in Japan, which would get a worldwide launch a bit later on, and that was Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, which of course did very well in Japan, but mostly on the 3DS, not on the Wii U. And then the Wii U slowly trickled out to the rest of the world, and then kind of died off in the years to follow. And it is such a sad story, the downfall of the Wii U. I really do think it deserves its own video in the future. But it did set up Nintendo for the success that would come in the near future with the Nintendo Switch, which they really rushed out the gate to try and put aside the Wii U and the failings of that system. And that is for the next video, so thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this look back at the Wii U. Let me know down in the comments below what you think of it. I honestly believe it's one of Nintendo's best and most innovative systems that they've ever made, and I will always think that as well. I've actually had it hooked up downstairs, and I've actually been playing it more than the Switch recently. I actually played all the way through Twilight Princess HD again recently, and I've started playing Star Fox Zero as well, which is one of my favourite games on the system too. But anyway, all of that's for a future video, so subscribe if you want to hear me gush more about my love of the Wii U in the future. And learning from the Wii U's mistakes, Nintendo ended up making their best console yet. So let's take a look finally at the development and launch of the Nintendo Switch. So the story of the Switch begins in 2013, just after the launch of the Wii U. And to begin this one, I'm going to read a little bit more out of Reggie's book here, because he sums up very well what the problems were at the time and what they were attempting to do to address them. We needed to clearly diagnose the problems with the Wii U and apply these learnings to our next home console launch, which would need to come very soon. A few of the issues were clearly observable. The Nintendo developed games were not launching on their original schedule. These delays meant we had huge gaps in new content for Wii U buyers. We weren't launching great games at an acceptable pace. Tied to this issue was the lack of content coming from independent developers to fill in our own schedule. They did also find some good points of the Wii U that they wanted to bring forward to the next system too. Here's Reggie explaining what they were. The key positive element from the launch of Wii U, players told us they loved the ability to play games on both the big screen television and then transition to playing their games only on the Wii U gamepad. But the gamepad needed to be within 20 to 30 feet of the Wii U console, with no physical barriers between the gamepad and the console so the wireless connection would work. Once consumers were too far away or obstructed, the gamepad would lose its connection, frustrating the player. This key insight would drive development of Nintendo's next system, codenamed NX. We would provide a hybrid console that would deliver a beautiful experience on the player's large screen TV and then be completely portable. This addressed a key player need, not having to stop your adventuring when you needed to leave the house to go to work or school. During a development meeting, I communicated this to the Kyoto team as the ability to play anywhere and anytime. This became the core positioning for NX. Beyond agreeing to the positioning, we also agreed on the product name, Nintendo Switch, communicating the ability to switch from large TV docked mode to portable handheld mode. And we also made the difficult decision to delay a key game, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, so it could launch on both the Wii U and Nintendo Switch. So that's what Reggie had to say about it, and it's an interesting start to the console. But the public wouldn't find out about Nintendo's next system until 2 years later in 2015. And on March 17th, 2015, Mr. Iwata would hold a press conference mostly to talk about Nintendo's involvement in the mobile gaming space and their collaboration with a company called DNA. They were there to speak about their integration of the Nintendo Network ID, which I'm actually using right now on the 3DS to re-download some games from the eShop. But the concept was at the time to be able to use this ID across all of the current Nintendo consoles, like the 3DS and like the Wii U, and also their future consoles too, and this was the first time that they announced their next system, at the time through the codename NX.
Membership service, which encompasses the existing Nintendo 3DS, Wii U, the new hardware with a brand new concept NX, and smart devices and PCs.
And as for that name, NX, Aonuma and Miyamoto were both asked what NX actually stood for, and they both basically said they didn't know, but it probably stood for Nintendo X, which doesn't really mean anything either. And interestingly, you can actually see the NX logo online. I'm not going to attempt to show it on this video because I really struggled to find it, and it looks like it's been taken down and copyright stricken everywhere that it's shown, so I can try and describe it. So basically, imagine a blue screen, completely blue, and inside it there's 3 white elements. There's a white circle with a blue dot at the top, and that circle would spin around, kind of like a dial that you would use on an old TV or a volume slider, something like that. It would spin around, and then the letters NX would appear. They're kind of in bold white writing, kind of similar to the final Switch logo, and that was basically it. It would just spin around, the words NX would pop up, and that would be the boot sequence. Unfortunately, I can't show it, but I am looking at it, so don't sue me, Nintendo. And a day after that announcement, Iwata was actually asked in an interview why he decided that was the right time to announce Nintendo's next console, and this is what he had to say. The reason why I announced NX, which by the way is not directly related to our alliance with DNA, was because I wanted to avoid any misunderstandings, such as Nintendo might have lost its passion for the dedicated game system business, and because I wanted many people to understand that Nintendo will continue its dedicated game system business with even stronger passion and motivation. We cannot make any further announcements about NX until next year. And although that was true, there wasn't any official announcements about NX until the year after, there were a few patents which leaked online around this time which show off some interesting concepts, many of which people thought were the NX, and there was a bunch of rumours flying around out there online, and there was a lot of kind of mock-ups of the system and things. There was this interesting article that I found from September 20th, 2015, where they showed one of these patents here, which was basically the tablet version of the NX, but it had sensors on each side of the tablet. But obviously this didn't come to pass, but it's interesting to see what Nintendo were thinking at the time around the motion sensing stuff, which was kind of put to the side a little bit during the NX development. And the other one, which again came from 2015, was this very famous concept of this oval touchscreen controller with the analog sticks actually inside the screen itself. And a lot of people were convinced that this is what the NX was, and there was this really convincing photo going around, which people actually thought was a legitimate photo of a leaked dev unit of the NX, and it still looks really convincing today. But the creator of this concept actually did come out and do a video stating that it was indeed fake, and it was actually just based on the patent that he'd seen online, and there was no bearing on whether this was actually the path that Nintendo was going to take forward. A few months after that DNA announcement, Iwata had a few things to say about the NX from an investors meeting that year. He said, "We can't talk about the NX. If we do, competitors may take our ideas and customers won't be surprised. The NX is new hardware and it will start from zero. However, the 3DS and Wii U have install bases. We will continue making 3DS and Wii U software while preparing for the NX. We are prioritising satisfying the customers who purchased the Wii U." So, according to Nintendo, the Wii U wasn't going anywhere. They were working on this new console as well as still making content for the old one too. So of course, fans were still holding out hope to hear something about the new console at E3 that year, but unfortunately that didn't end up happening, and Reggie only had one thing to say about the NX, and I'll let him do the talking here.
Recently, Mr. Iwata has made several announcements on how Nintendo itself is being transformed, with expansion to Universal theme parks, mobile devices, and our new dedicated game platform, codenamed NX, which we'll tell you more about in 2016. Today, our purpose is more immediate.
There is one really cool internal Nintendo thing that I found though before we move on to the public reveal of the system. Nintendo shared these pictures internally to allow people to understand the concept of the NX, and I love how much detail they went into here, and the pictures are just so cute, and it really does sell all of the different possibilities of the system too. And now we're moving into 2016, and there was a bunch of really interesting pieces of information that came out this year. And it's really interesting looking back and seeing what some of the gaming websites at the time thought the system would be capable of too. Eurogamer was the first website to break the news. Apparently they had a lot of sources confirming this information was true, and it did turn out to be true as well. They also shared this very early concept drawing of what the NX or Nintendo Switch would end up looking like, which is very close to the final design. They stated here at the top of this website that Nintendo's upcoming NX will be a portable handheld console with detachable controllers. A number of sources have confirmed to Eurogamer. On the move, NX will function as a high-powered handheld console with its own display. So far, so normal, but here's the twist. We've heard the screen is bookended by two controller sections on either side, which can be attached or detached as required. Then, when you get home, the system can connect to the TV for gaming on the big screen. They also said here that Digital Foundry did a deep dive on the chip that was confirmed to be true by the same sources, which was the Nvidia Tegra X1, which did end up being true, and obviously now with the Switch 2 coming out, Nvidia is back with a brand new chip for the Switch 2. They also first mentioned here that the NX would use cartridges instead of discs, and it's interesting how they found this bit of information out. There was actually a trademark for Breath of the Wild that confirmed that the game would run on both discs and cartridges. There was also rumours floating around at this time that various Wii U games would end up getting ports for the Switch, which we know the Switch basically became the Wii U in cartridge form. The amount of games that got ported from the Wii U is just insane, and that really helped bolster Nintendo's library for the entire of the Switch's life. I mean, Xenoblade X only came out a few months ago, so they have been milking the Wii U library for all it's worth, and it just goes to show how great of a library that system had. And it's so great that more people have been able to play the games today on a much more popular system, despite the games, in my opinion, being for the most part more interesting on the Wii U because of the various extra features it had. But even so, I'm really glad that they got to see the light of day on a much more popular console. It does make me wonder what Nintendo's going to do with the Switch 2 now that they don't have a unpopular back catalogue to dive into to bring across. Hopefully that means we'll get to see more original content this generation. Now, unfortunately, there wasn't really much to see in the way of prototypes for the console, and this has been one of my favourite things to do in this series, is show off all of the various designs over time until they ended up on the final one. For the most part, the Switch looked identical all the way through its development as far as I can see. Here's a few very early builds of the Nintendo Switch and of the Joy-Cons, and there are a few very subtle differences. So as you can see here on the left Joy-Con, the screenshot button was actually a picture of a camera instead of just the square with the circle in like it is on the final unit. And the sync button was red. So there's a slight difference there too. Also on this second version of the Joy-Con, the ZL and ZR buttons were just called L and R instead. And the only other very, very small difference between prototype and retail release was the fact that the volume buttons on the top changed ever so slightly from up and down arrows to plus and minus arrows, and that is about all we get in terms of prototype designs for the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo hasn't even shared any officially like they did with the Wii U and all of their previous consoles, which I really thought was fascinating, so I really hope that something comes to light in the future and we can see more about their design process, because I love seeing those kind of things out there online. And the dev kit isn't really that interesting either compared to all of the previous console ones, which looked completely different to what they were when they finally came out for the public. The Switch's dev kit is basically a Nintendo Switch with a bit of a block on the back for some ports to plug into the computer, and nothing more than that really. We can see here that the developer of Outlast shared how the dev kit looks. I guess the only difference is it doesn't seem like it comes with a dock. You just plug the HDMI and the power directly into the Switch itself, and then you just use the ports on the back of the console that way. So the actual console itself looks pretty much identical. Kind of disappointing, if I'm completely honest. Although I did hear that the Switch's dev kit is a lot cheaper than any of the previous consoles, so that might explain why there's been so many more games released for the Switch, just because it was a lot more accessible for people. Although maybe that's not entirely a good thing if you've looked on the eShop. I'll just leave it at that. And then on October 20th, 2016, the Nintendo Switch was revealed in a YouTube video. It was mostly a video showing off all of the different styles of being able to play the system, but there were a few sneak peeks into a few new games that would end up on the console, including our first glimpse at Mario Odyssey. As well as an updated version of Mario Kart, the confirmation that Breath of the Wild will also be on the Switch. Skyrim was shown off too, and Splatoon as well. And it really was an amazing trailer. I remember being so impressed with the entire concept and so excited to get my hands on one too. And then before the launch of the console, Nintendo released a bunch of game trailers to show people what to expect when the system dropped, and in the launch window as well. So we got trailers for Breath of the Wild, Xenoblade 2, Mario Odyssey, Splatoon 2, Bomberman R, Snipperclips, and 1-2-Switch. And now we're moving forward another year to 2017 and the launch of the console itself. And the console launched worldwide in March, but the month before that, around the world, Nintendo put on various preview events, and I was lucky enough to be invited to one in Birmingham here in the UK, and I had an incredible time at the show as well. And because this happened more recently, I've actually got footage of myself at the event that you can actually watch here on this channel. I got to enjoy things like ARMS for the first time and feel the Joy-Cons and try out some of the motion controls as well as playing Mario Kart, Zelda Breath of the Wild, and a bunch of the smaller games as well, like Snipperclips, which I thought was really fun too, and 1-2-Switch, which I thought was an interesting tech demo, and I did end up actually getting it at launch, but it is one of those games that you play once and then you never put back in the system ever again, and it really should have been a pack-in game and not a full-priced launch title. And as for launch titles, despite the console launching on exactly the same day across Japan, America, and Europe, each region had its own set of launch games. In the various regions in America, physically, they got 1-2-Switch, Just Dance 2017, Skylanders Imaginators, Super Bomberman R, and Zelda Breath of the Wild. Japan actually got a lot more games than America. As well as the ones I mentioned, they also got Disgaea 5 Complete, Dragon Quest Heroes 1 and 2, I Am Setsuna, Nobunaga's Ambition, and Puyo Puyo Tetris as well. And here in the UK, we got the same as America in terms of physical launch titles. And as for the launch dates, Japan, US, and Europe all launched on March 3rd, followed in December by Korea and Taiwan, on the 1st of December, and that was it for a while until 2 years later when it came out on December the 10th in China, and finally September 20th, 2020 in Brazil. And as for the games that I got on launch, I picked up these three here. Obviously, Breath of the Wild. I'm pretty sure every single person who bought the console also bought this game. And I also picked up Bomberman and 1-2 Switch as well, and I did have some fun with 1-2 Switch, and Bomberman was great to play in multiplayer, but obviously the star of the show for the launch of the console was Breath of the Wild. I am glad they delayed it for the launch of a new system, because it was so exciting to be able to play a brand new Zelda game on a brand new console, just like we did on the Wii all those years ago with Twilight Princess. It felt honestly as magical as playing Twilight Princess on the Wii for the first time. And here's the original box for the original Nintendo Switch console. It's a really nice box, I think, and it very clearly demonstrates the concept of the system. Like, you've got handheld on one side and you've got the TV Play on the other, and I honestly think Nintendo did a fantastic job with the marketing, which was an absolute disaster with their previous consoles. So it was just great that people understood what this was all about right from the start. So the next version of the system was actually the Nintendo Switch Lite, which was an entirely portable version of the console. I like to think of this as the evolution of the Game Boy Advance, and it really does fill that Nintendo handheld gap really nicely, whilst also letting Nintendo focus on just making games for one system. And obviously it was a lot cheaper as well, so this was a great alternative for kids or for families who wanted a second system just to be able to play outside of the house. If you want to see a comparison of the two consoles, here's my launch day Nintendo Switch with the Zelda Joy-Cons there, not the original ones, but for a comparison between that and the Switch Lite, the Switch Lite isn't actually as small as I was hoping it would be. As you can see, it's only very slightly smaller, although the screen itself's fairly small, but it's really not small enough to fit in the pocket, which is what I would have really liked from a new Nintendo dedicated handheld. I would love to see something kind of along the same size as the 3DS XL. I think that would be perfect, because this is still slightly too big, in my opinion, but let me know what you think down in the comments below. And then there was a second version of the basic Nintendo Switch, which is like this Animal Crossing one that I've got here, which is exactly the same as the console in terms of design, but it did include a better battery, so you could get more battery life out of this second revision of the console, basically. It was never really marketed separately, but it just turns out that it has slightly different internals. And the Switch Lite was launched in September of 2019, so 2 years after the original system. And then in 2021, when everyone was expecting a Switch Pro, Nintendo decided to just release an updated version of the regular Switch with an OLED screen, but there are a few other improvements as well as just the OLED ones, and I've got both the Pokemon and the Tears of the Kingdom special editions here, and I absolutely love the Switch OLED. I think the screen is fantastic. I love the feel of it, I love the improved dock as well, and for a size comparison, it is very slightly bigger than the original Switch, but the screen itself, when you turn them on, is noticeably bigger, and it's really nice to play games on this one. And this one's the Pokemon edition, if you want to see what it looks like on the back. Really interesting design, just a shame the game wasn't really that good, although I'm very much looking forward to playing it on the Switch too, and seeing whether I enjoy it a bit more on the new console. So that was the history and launch of every Nintendo home console so far. Thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this as much as I've enjoyed making it. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this and want to see more history videos in the future. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all again very soon. Goodbye.